Oh, sorry, I'll start again. Good morning. Can I welcome our members, officers and members of the public and press to today's meeting of the Transport Committee. The main item today will be a discussion on the Transport for London funding settlement, which we now have. But we have some short items of business first. Can you all please make sure your electronic devices are switched off or on silent mode to avoid unnecessary interruptions this morning? And can I start by asking our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. No apologies for absence this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you, members. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Can I ask that a committee to note the recommendations set out in item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? None. Thank you very much. Item 3 is the minutes of the previous meeting. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee held on the 6th of September to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. And item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the ongoing actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence received?
Noted.
Thank you. We have also some responses to committee outputs. So can we note the recent responses to the committee outputs, namely the response from the Deputy Mayor for Transport on our letter on the Central London bus review consultation, and the response from the Mayor of London to our letter on the ultra emission zone expansion, which are both in the appendices.
Noted.
Thank you. Right, so we move on to our main item of business, which is a question and answer session on the Transport for London funding settlement with government. I'd like to welcome our guests for this item. With us we have Andy Byford, the Commissioner of TfL, and we have Patrick Doig, who is the Statutory Chief Finance Officer at TfL currently. And then finally, we have Seb Dance, who is the Deputy Mayor for Transport. Thank you all for coming along today. It will be really interesting to hear your views on what has been agreed. So I'll kick off the main questions. My first question, I think starting with Seb and moving across to each of you. First of all, how satisfied are you with the funding settlement reached with the government? Also, what have the challenges been in reaching the agreement, and where have you had to compromise?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you for your warm welcome this morning. It's good to see everyone here in this fabulous chamber. I mean, overall, obviously, it's been a very difficult process. I don't mind saying. To get to the agreement that we have. There was really an existential challenge in terms of whether or not it was possible to avoid some very drastic cuts to service provision. And this deal avoids those drastic cuts. And so, in that respect, it's both a relief, but also a recognition, I think, of the enormous work that's gone in to make the case for publicly funding public transport. As you'll all be aware, TfL is uniquely dependent on fare revenue compared to transport authorities around the world, and the pandemic has had an enormous impact, obviously, on that revenue. Ridership figures down considerably, as you know, down to 95%, down by 95% during the worst of the pandemic. And we're not seeing a full recovery since then. Different travel patterns, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a bit. So getting that case across that we needed government support was difficult in and of itself, but I'm pleased that we have won that case, that the government has agreed. So there is also a hint of gratefulness, I should say, that we are in receipt of the money that enables us to avoid those drastic cuts. In terms of where we've compromised and where we've managed to get a lot of movement, it should be noted that the agreement that we've ended up with was different to the agreement that was originally proposed by the then Secretary of State. So we have managed to move government quite substantially in terms of the amount of money, but also obviously in terms of the freedom that we have to use that money. And I think overall we've achieved the best balance we could, but there is still a significant shortfall in the funding that the government has given TfL. And we will have to find ways of addressing that shortfall. And again, I'm sure we'll talk about that some more. But overall, I'm as I say, I think my first emotion, relief, is probably the strongest one that I would express on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Should we move to Andy Byford now? Particularly, I think, if you can talk about the challenges there were in getting to that agreement and the compromises that London has had to make.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Well, I'd certainly echo what Seb said. I think it's the best deal that we could have got in the circumstances, and it was a long and drawn-out process. It was quite frustrating. It was hard work, but that's what we're paid to do at the end of the day. The key thing for all of us at TfL was to make sure that we did get a long-term deal. Now, ultimately, ideally, we wanted a longer-term deal than that. We wanted to get, I mean, I set out for 5 years. I'd have settled for 3. We ended up with 20 months. So I should preface my comments, though, by looking at in the context. Overall, through the pandemic, we were in receipt of £6 billion from Her Majesty's government, which is no small amount. And I have gone on the record, I'll do it again, of saying I'm very grateful for that. But we wanted to get that longer-term deal because the previous deals, which were very short-term, meant that we were living this hand-to-mouth existence, which is in itself inherently inefficient, and meant that we couldn't plan with certainty. So we've ended up with 20 months. It's a 1.2 billion additional funding injection. And what it does mean is, as Seb says, we moved away from that calamitous managed decline scenario. But where we've had to compromise is one on the duration. So it wasn't the 3 years we were looking for. 20 months was the best that we could secure. And in terms of the conditions, some of them we probably wouldn't have wanted to sign up for, but my view was being realistic. You were never going to get cash without conditions. So our mission, which I believe that we met, was to negotiate with government to improve both the quantum, which we did. The quantum was improved over the original offer that we were made, and to soften the conditions to the point that they were fair and that they were deliverable. And for me, a badge of honour was to make sure that they were fair to my colleagues who did see us through the pandemic. So in summary, it was the best deal we could have got in the circumstances.
Okay, just if I can ask, Seb just mentioned that you did better in terms of money, and you've outlined that already, but also in terms of freedom compared with what the Secretary of State originally proposed. We've got questions following on all the things that are in the deal, yeah. But what's not in the deal? What did you manage to remove in terms of the freedom aspect of it?
The main, and Patrick will wish to comment on this, I'm sure, the main thing that we wanted to change over and above the original offer that was made to us, that was very, very prescriptive in terms of what could be, what we could have in terms of quantum and what we could do with operating expenditure, operating revenue, and what we could do by way of capital revenue. And normally, in normal times, there is an entirely legitimate way of moving between those two budgets. So you can legitimately shift money between the two. As originally proposed, the deal was very, very prescriptive, and that meant de facto that limited what we could do, and that we felt was unacceptable. So we successfully argued for there to be more flexibility within the two budgets, capital and revenue. And then the second point, which I'm sure we'll come into in more detail, was there was absolute prescription initially around the conditions relating to pensions, and we successfully got the wording changed on that, such that it was something that I could recommend to my board, and I could look in the eyes of 27,000 colleagues and say that what we've agreed to is actually fair and deliverable.
Okay, thank you very much. And Patrick, do you have anything to add to those sentiments? Are you confident now that we can make it through the next 20 months and then beyond?
Good morning. Yes, I am confident. We wouldn't have signed up for this agreement if we weren't, and we wouldn't have been able to maintain our balanced budget in the way we have if we weren't. That's a combination of both the funding settlement we secured with government and the additional financing support the GLA has offered. That combination of packages is what gives me the confidence that we can manage this. But I certainly echo my colleagues' comments, particularly on that sense of relief, that the consequence of no deal was far, far worse than even our managed decline budget. It's almost unthinkable what that could have meant for London. So avoiding that is huge. Just to add to Andy's point about the flexibility, As you would have seen, the deal is quite complex because it combines a revenue funding deal and additional capital support, and is prescriptive between a revenue mechanism, an operating envelope and a capital envelope. So part of the negotiation was to increase the overall quantum, but the other crucial aspect was to allow us more flexibility between those different envelopes, which allowed us to put the available funding into the revenue element, which is what we needed to balance the budget. And that's what we were able to achieve in those discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. And then before I pass over to my colleagues, a question to Andy. At our February Transport Committee, you spoke about the impact of all the negotiations and the uncertainty on morale at TfL, and your fear of brain drain. Did all these negotiations, the complexity of it all, contribute to your decision to step down as Commissioner?
No, and that's a legitimate question, but they did not, actually. What I said at the time, I stand by, because I really did feel that this ongoing uncertainty was having an impact on people who might be seduced to go elsewhere by longer security of tenure, by more money potentially, and just less stress. My reasons for leaving are entirely different. I set out to do two primary things, which were to lead TfL through the COVID crisis in all its forms, you know, the impact on ridership, morale and capability, and also the revenue, to secure a long-term deal and to get the Elizabeth line open. And for personal reasons, I want to go back to the US with my wife. It has had a bad effect, a really bad effect, this whole uncertainty on the whole organisation. So one of the things I have put huge effort into is rallying the organisation, and going all over the whole of TfL, really to rally the troops, to make sure that they know that we're out there, we're tenaciously fighting for a budget, and that ultimately we will prevail, which we did. So I feel I leave it in good hands. We've got a very capable person in the form of Andy Lord, who will be the interim commissioner. Very good bench strength in terms of the ExCo and the next levels down, and a new structure that will see TfL fair for the next 5 years' challenges.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Sean Bailey now for further questions. We've got lots of them, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to our guests. Let me start with the Deputy Mayor. How are you doing, Seb? Good morning. What is the main purpose of TfL's new financing facility, and why is it needed?
Thank you very much. Good morning to you. I'm very well, thank you. So the new financing facility, I think probably Patrick might be better able to answer this question.
That's fine, it's fine.
May I pass to Patrick?
Absolutely,
Thank you.
absolutely. Good.
Thanks, sir. So the financing facility is what it says on the tin. It's a financing facility, and that's important, because this does not provide TfL additional funding, but what it allows us to do is to draw down on funding in advance from the GLA, with the consequence of receiving less funding in future. So it allows us to bring that funding through when needed. So what we can do is we can draw down up to £500 million from the GLA if needed to maintain that balanced budget, but as a consequence we receive less funding in future. So it doesn't replace the need to make the efficiency savings, and it doesn't allow us to increase the overall outputs we can deliver, but it provides that safety net against further risks that remain in our budget. So the benefit of this finance facility is twofold. Firstly, it gives us the confidence we can maintain a balanced budget, even though we've got risks that we still face, and even though there are further savings we need to make. But the other benefit of the financing facility is it allows us to continue to let long-term contracts, particularly on those on the bus network that are 7 years, whilst we work through the savings. Without that safety net in place, we'd have to continue to pause letting bus contracts whilst we work through that savings delivery, which would have disrupted the bus network and could have led us to make unnecessary service reductions, because we didn't have certainty on how to pay for those bus contracts. But the financing facility allows us to avoid that, maintain the balanced budget, continue letting long-term contracts.
Thank you. Just one small additional question. You talked about risks, this helping you mitigate some risks. Could you give us an example of one of the risks you're talking about?
So the funding settlement does actually mitigate some of our key risks, which we can talk about later on if required, but doesn't mitigate against them all. So although the revenue mechanism, the funding settlement, protects us against passenger income, it doesn't protect us against volatility in non-passenger income, be that through our road user charging schemes, advertising, estates, property, those other revenue sources which are increasingly important and also volatile, are unprotected against this. We also have the risk of delivering those further savings. We are committed to doing everything we can to find the further 230 million savings required, but that does remain a risk until those savings are identified and delivered. So they're two of the key risks that remain with us that this finance facility helps to mitigate.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Seb. I'm back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Passing over to my colleague Caroline Pigeon. Can I just ask one supplementary on that, though? Because there is a letter of comfort that was published just recently, and the mayoral decision on the finance facility, which starts off by allowing council tax and business rate, funding reserves to be passed over. That comes before the finance facility, as I understand it. And then 3 bullet points outlining the finance facility. And it says revenue or capital grant. That's useful. So that's a flexible finance facility using retained business rates. It then talks about a share of green bond proceeds. Can you tell us a tiny bit more about how that might work, and whether or not green bond issuing contributes to our overall GLA borrowing cap?
So the green bond is a supplementary financing stream over and above this financing facility, and the Mayor and the GLA are proceeding at pace with that GLA green bond programme. Where it comes in for us in particular is one of the conditions of the funding settlement is we can't use government funding to fund any policy decisions which charge motorists. So, for example, if the Mayor did decide to proceed with GLULES, we couldn't use the funding settlement from government to fund that decision. Therefore, we are working very collaboratively with the GLA to look at how the green bond could be a financing source for those types of investment, because they deliver environmental benefits, but also allow us to spread the cost of those investments over a period of time. So we haven't yet confirmed if we will use the green bond, but it's another financing stream that gives us confidence that we can deliver on the mayoral priorities within the available funding we have.
Okay, and then, so just to get clarification on this, and presumably, I mean, you're not speaking on behalf of the GLA, but TfL has a similar situation. The last part of that bullet point says, provided the GLA's affordable borrowing limit is not exceeded. So if we were to issue green bonds, that would add to our own debts, is that correct?
That's correct. It would score against the GLA debt facility rather than the TfL debt facility.
Okay, that's interesting. I think our other committees will have further questions about that coming up. Passing over to my colleague Caroline Pigeon.
I want to pick up the issues of governance, because there's this huge section, several paragraphs towards the end of the letter, going through additional governance arrangements that the government are insisting are put in place. If I start with Seb and then bring Andy in, do you feel the governance arrangements that surround the deal support TfL to deliver the Mayor's goals and plans?
Yes, thank you. The governance arrangements, obviously you would expect conditions to come attached to any offer of financial support from government. And I suppose, we want the fewest conditions and government would want the most conditions. And what we have here is, as ever with these agreements, a compromise between those two positions. The different kind of structures that are proposed kind of change slightly, I think, what we have been operating under. In some instances, they might present us with more flexibility. So, for example, when it comes to borough funding and active travel, it specifies where we would work with government bodies, but not with a body that we have hitherto been working with, the Active Travel Oversight Group. So there could well be more flexibility there. It remains to be seen. Obviously, the oversight group in general is the main body is the main question mark, I suppose, in terms of how that will operate going forward. I don't think it will work against our objectives at all. The MTS is clear. The target that we have for 80% of all journeys by active and public transport by 2041 remains. And I should say that throughout this process, that overriding target has been front and central in everything that we've done, in everything that we've negotiated, and everything that the Mayor has put pressure on TfL to negotiate. So I'm confident that the government's structures won't muddy that. But obviously, as with anything that's new and untested, we'll have to see. And it's very important, obviously, that you as the Assembly retain your ability to scrutinise and maintain the highest levels of transparency in terms of that relationship.
That's very helpful. Andy, could I bring you in? Because when I look at this, and we've got this oversight group that's going to meet every quarter. It's going to be chaired by a director at the DFT. It's going to have Treasury on it, number 10 on it, as well as TfL. Very high-level, high-powered group. You've then also got the strategic and technical special representative invited. You've got various people appointed who will attend TfL board meetings and your programme and investment committee. So really still very much involved in some of the structures at TfL. Is that going to cause you any issues, do you see?
Well, good morning. I think time will tell, but what I would say is it is, I think, my view, my read on it is it is an improvement over that which has been in place to date.
Can you remind us that?
Which was, well, they had the Active Travel Oversight Group, which was a much more intrusive entity where we really were being micromanaged. And my problem with micromanagement is, apropos the chair's previous question, that in itself can cause some morale issues if experts feel that they really are not being listened to, or that they're being micromanaged or suffocated by government oversight, and if there is political pressure put upon them, which we should always resist as public servants, and we do. I think this new iteration is better, as the Deputy Mayor said. I had to be pragmatic in recommending this to the board. We were never going to get the kind of quantum that we've received, 6 billion overall, with no conditions and with no oversight. That would be naive to expect. So I think the acid test will be how it works in practice, but my view is this is a better arrangement, and as long as the experts are allowed to give their views and do their work, it's tolerable.
Okay, and so what do you see both of these groups covering? Have you got into that yet, the Financial Sustainability Group and the Oversight Group? And how transparent will their work be? Will it be open to us as an Assembly to be able to scrutinise those documents as we do TfLs?
Well, I mean, I'm sure these sorts of fora will continue, and you'll be able to question my colleagues going forward about the kinds of things that go on in those groups. With the financial oversight group, that is looking to see, are we maintaining the cash balance that we have committed to? Are we are we sticking to the principles and the conditions that have been agreed to? I mean, this most recent funding letter, as Patrick said, is incredibly complex. It ran to 62 subclauses. So there's an oversight to see, are we meeting the terms of our agreement, both in spirit and also in any deadlines that are stipulated, e.g. the pensions deadlines that are stipulated within it. And then there's the more practical working group, which is literally looking at things like active travel. Are we meeting our conditions in terms of what we do with regard to working with Active Travel England? So they're two slightly different, but with the same overall objective. Are you meeting the conditions in return for the money that's been provided? Which,
of course, is quite reasonable, and if it's not too intrusive, then
that's the acid test, right? Yeah. It's oversight is good, micromanagement is a problem.
Yeah. And it says in the agreement that DFT officials will work with TfL counterparts ahead of each oversight group to review progress on each work stream. Sounds like lots of processes in place, and they may already be there, so it's a case of pulling the data off the systems. But when we discussed before, way back in February, about all these ongoing negotiations, you talked about how resource intensive they have been. How much resource do you expect may need to go in to these governance meetings and these groups over and above what would be your norm?
Sure. I mean, it's hard to quantify until we actually get going on it, but clearly we will need to assign resource to it. But what I would say is DFT equally are busy people. What we should be aiming to do over time is get this thing to work like a well-oiled machine, such that the pre-meets do the work to make sure that this the intent of the funding deal is being met, and that we are able to proceed to deliver the MTS and do everything that the funding deal envisaged, but without unnecessary bureaucracy. So I think time will tell, and it may be a question you might want to pose in a few months' time once it's had a chance to get underway.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. And finally, for me, obviously they talk about in here a strategic special representative and a technical special representative will be appointed by the Secretary of State. Have you any news of those individuals yet?
If this strategic representatives, I think, is code for the person who will be on the board, right? Yes, we do know who that is. It's a guy called John Hall, who is a Deputy Director General at the Department for Transport. And I welcome that, actually. He is an official, and I welcome that, A, because he's an official, and B, because John knows the deal intimately. Yes. He was one of the primary people with whom we discussed the deal.
And
so can I just add to that? So Andy's correct. There are two representatives under this funding settlement that have been present in previous funding settlements as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a technical special representative. Up until this point, that's been a Becky Wood, who's worked with the DFT and knows TfL well. We expect her to continue. Right. And as Andy's just said, we are anticipating that John Hall will be appointed the strategic special representative, although we're still waiting the final confirmation of that. But
these are officials rather than political appointees, which is
that's a difference between this and the previous funding settlement.
Precisely. So that hopefully will make things work more smoothly. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. And it should be noted, we did ask the DFT to send along people to this meeting, but they did not do so. So I think we'll probably, as a committee, be writing to them with some further questions about things like the transparency, which obviously matters to us a lot. Okay, handing over now to Assemblymember Baker. Ellie, you have questions on financing again.
I do. Lots of questions about finance. Thanks. I think the first question is addressed to... I think the first question is addressed to Patrick. How much extra money for operational funding is being given in real terms, and when will that be received? Question.
So the total quantum of funding provided in this funding settlement is 1.2 billion. Mm-hmm. There was also the revenue true-up mechanism, which could add to that if our actual revenue falls below the projection the DFT have given. But if we look at the 1.2 billion of what we call base funding, the certain funding that we receive, that broadly splits into 800 million for capital, albeit only 200 million of that is additional funding for TfL, and 400 million for revenue. That figure is over the course of this year and next year, and the phasing is in one of the annexes of the funding settlement.
Thanks. And how has TfL reduced its funding gap from 740 million to 230 million?
Thank you. So to just give some context between the funding gap. So our original request that we made in our budget we published in March was for a further 900 million of funding. That's a number I think we discussed with you or other committees previously. So this funding settlement, as I said, provides around 400 million of revenue funding, but it also comes with some conditions which add to our operational costs, albeit things that we wanted to do. We wanted to avoid the deep bus cuts, for example, but that slightly increases the funding gap. And then the 400 comes in, which leaves us with the pre-mitigation funding gap of 740 million that you quoted. That's over 2 years. But, as I mentioned briefly before, the funding settlement provides some really important risk mitigation for us, above and beyond the base funding cash. The two most significant are mitigation on passenger demand volatility and inflation. And they're probably the two largest financial risks that we face right now, and probably the two largest financial risks that any organisation around the UK faces right now. So with that risk mitigation in place, we were able to take a number of further actions to reduce that funding gap further. So we took the decision that we didn't need to increase our cash reserves further because our risk profile was lower. That saved around 200 million. We can hold a lower level of operating contingency in the budget because, again, the risks that contingency is sized against have reduced. That saves around 100 million over the 2 years. And the inflation mechanism not only provides certainty against inflation risk, it will provide some increased funding next year if inflation stays at the currently expected levels. We expect that to be around about 150 million. And finally, there were some further savings that we have been working on of around about 50 million compared to our March budget. So those combination of measures reduces that pre-mitigation funding gap of 740 million down to the 230 million pounds savings that are still needed to be found. But really importantly, we couldn't have taken those actions without the funding settlement being in place. It's that protection the funding settlement that gave us that allowed us to take those actions. Thank you.
Thanks. And what revenue-raising options are TfL considering to make the budget balance?
Thanks, Ellie. So the GLA budget, which was published in February, outlines a number of options that the Mayor could consider, some of which have been implemented and some of which are still in consideration. So the council tax Band D precept increase, for example, has been implemented and accepted by government. In addition, the Mayor is also looking at considering phasing in the eligibility criteria for the existing 60-plus Oyster card. Fares for travel on the Piccadilly line to Heathrow been increased to peak rates, as has the initial purchase price of Oyster cards. And there's also consideration being given into phasing out the travel card scheme on non-TfL services in London. So there's a whole range of options, none of which we would leap on with joy, but they're nonetheless being considered as necessary to try and close that gap.
Those are the ones, those are all previously on the table for discussion, weren't they? Are there any additional revenue-raising options that are now in play that are being considered?
Obviously, the matter of fares is reserved for the Mayor, and there are a number of assumptions that are in TfL's forecast for budgeting, which will obviously be part of the consideration that the Mayor takes into account when setting fares. But no, at this point, there aren't any other options that are being actively considered. Of course, we have to, with all of these things, bear in mind the relationship between fare increase and usage. There is a trade-off, isn't there? The more you raise fares, yes, you might well increase income in the short term, but you will obviously then deter people from using the network, which overall reduces overall income. So it's not simply a question of raising fares to bridge the gap. So what's been considered so far, the Mayor would consider as the kind of right side of that balance, but a wholesale increase in fares is not something that we think would be a good idea overall.
Okay, I think we're going to come back to fares in a bit more detail in that modelling in a bit. Thank you. But just specifically, you haven't mentioned it, but just to check, is there any consideration of further fare differentiation, such as the Heathrow fare increase?
No, that's the only.
That's the list.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. So the next question is from Assemblymember Doig.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. If I can start off with you, Deputy Mayor. So how does this settlement affect TfL's pension scheme?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Umesh. So obviously there is a key issue at the heart of this deal, which is the requirement that the government have put in that we explore options to change TfL's pension. And it should be pointed out, of course, that throughout this process, TfL has been clear that no change is one of the options. And that is a very important point to make, because we don't consider it right to make changes to the pension scheme for the sake of it. If any changes are made, they have to be carefully and considerately considered in conjunction, of course, with scheme members. And that is a very complex process, but it's also a proper process that needs to be followed and can't be done on a whim. Therefore, obviously, there is a process that is underway at the moment to meet the conditions of the government's funding settlement. Several deadlines are in place in order for us to report back to government on some of the progress. So, for example, by the 27th of September, we provided views on Sir Brendan Barber's final report, which was released a few months ago. By the 14th of October, TfL must shortlist 2 categories of options for further consideration, but these will again be submitted alongside a status quo option. And by the 31st of January 2023, TfL will have to set out a preferred course of action along with an implementation plan if appropriate. And of course, I should also point out that any reform would need the support of central government. Any action on pensions would have to involve potentially government legislation as well. So it's not an easy path, and of course the mere uncertainty that exists causes tension, and is an issue in terms of potential strike action as well. So this is a very delicate and difficult issue. And we want to make it very clear that we won't accept change for the sake of change.
If I come to you, Commissioner.
I'd echo that, Assembly Member, what Seb has just said. And only this morning I passed through King's Cross Station and I talked to my colleagues on the gate line about pensions, because it is an issue of concern to them. But we would not have agreed to conditions that were unfair to our colleagues. And what we have agreed to, as the Deputy Mayor just summarised, we've agreed to look at options. Options do not bind you to anything. Options are not proposals. What we have said is we will look at options. And there may be some sensible things that we can jointly agree with our unions that would make sense in terms of protecting the pension going forward. But a good example would be where I think at the very start the Chair asked me about the nature of the deal. One element that we changed within the deal was the original wording was that £100 million, which is drawn from another report, not actually from the Barber report, must be found in relation to forward savings off the pension. We absolutely pushed back on that. That would have been wholly unacceptable. That would have resulted in a cut of benefits of a third cut in benefits, 33% cut in benefits to our colleagues. And I would never have agreed to that. And I made it very clear that was absolutely a red line. We would not agree to that. What the wording now says is that we should aim for 100 million, but we have also we're making the case that there's no way that can be found from forward savings. So all we've agreed to is options. It's very much a live debate, but for me it was an absolute red line to do anything that would be unfair to TfL staff who did see us through the pandemic. And in no way should we ever agree to a pension arrangement that is worse than what other public sector employees get.
Patrick, have you got anything to add to what the Commissioner has said?
No, except I'm back here on Thursday in front of you and some of your colleagues. We're having a deep dive on GLA pensions, including TfL pensions, so we're happy to explore it further then.
Okay, well, also to consider it further here, I have supplementary questions from Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. I'm afraid this tenuous link here, but it's the only section I could find to ask the question. We're talking about benefits for employees, of course, which, Commissioner, you are one. And first of all, congratulations on delivering the financial deal. I know it's a tough job, and I'm sure you spent nearly every day of your working hours working on that. But we do know that your predecessor received hundreds of thousands of pounds in bonuses, Mr. Byford. I'd be very interested to know how many or how much you've received in bonuses during your short tenure.
That's an easy question to answer. Nothing. And I've also, I think my expenses, the last time I looked at them, were something like less than £100. So no, I have not received any bonus during my tenure.
I think that says even more about you. So thank you very much for what you've done for London.
It's been my honour and my privilege, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assembly Member Prince. Okay, so moving over now to Assembly Member Garrett for further questions about how all this financing is going to work.
Morning. So one of the uncertainties with all of this, of course, is about the change in passenger numbers, to what extent it was a blip, to what extent it was a permanent ongoing change in passengers and therefore revenue levels. And I think you mentioned this earlier, Patrick, so I guess it's the question for you really about this top-up, top-up and true-up process, so which is obviously designed to try to try to take out some of the uncertainty. In effect, I think the government is carrying the risk of passenger numbers and therefore revenue. So I wondered if you could sort of give us a bit more detail about how that works, and in particular what that means for TfL if passenger numbers either go up or stay where they are or go down further.
Thank you. So you're absolutely right. The revenue mechanism in the funding settlement guarantees a level of passenger income for TfL over the next 20-month period, such that if our actual revenue falls below the profile set out in Annex B of the funding settlement, government will increase their funding to maintain that level. But the quid pro quo is if our passenger demand increases more than expected and revenue is higher than expected, government will receive that benefit. So TfL have a certainty over passenger income over this period. That's crucial at this time. Even though we are hoping the pandemic-related risk is decreasing, the economic uncertainty we're facing means that actually the volatility in demand and the potential risk in demand is really significant. So the benefits for us in our organisation are twofold. Firstly, as I already described in the previous question, having a lower risk profile means that we can hold lower cash reserves and redeploy those cash reserves to benefit London and those that use our services. The second element is that it provides a certainty. And actually, obviously, the reduction in funding has been the key issue, but closely followed by uncertainty. That makes it very difficult for us to make investment decisions. So having certainty over income for the next 18, 19 months gives us the certainty required to invest and improve our services and maintain our assets for our customers as well. So it's a very significant benefit, and one I wasn't expecting necessarily to be in place. This was a favourable proposition the government made for us.
May I just add to that, really briefly? I should have, in answer to Chair Berry's initial question, said that precise point, that we were pleasantly surprised by to get the top-up. We were expecting through March 23, and it was actually till March 24, end of March, April 24. That was a pleasant surprise, as was the inflation mechanism, which DfT offered up to us, is not going to be offered to any other department. So it was one of the many reasons why we thought it was the best possible deal we could get, and we took it.
Sorry, actually, it wasn't on my question, but that's so the inflation offer. What was the inflation offer that TfL has?
So there's, again, in some complicated envelope set out in the deal, the operating envelope, which funds our revenue costs, has a series of adjustments that can be made. One is on inflation, such that if actual inflation exceeds the estimates we made in our March budget, which is almost certain at this point, the operating envelope will increase and more funding will be provided for TfL. That mechanism is capped this year at £15 million, so a relatively small amount, but still an important amount. But next year, the uplift is uncapped, such that the settlement outlines a process that we're going to go through in January to look at the latest OBR projections on inflation, and we'll use those in the operating envelope, and our funding will be increased to that level at that point. So that's very beneficial given the uncertainty around inflation at the moment.
That is quite the coup. Yeah. And so, sorry, boring technical question. What's the measure of inflation used? Is it CPI, RPI, or is it the actual contracts that you're seeing?
Well, actually, that's a detail that we need to work through with government, and it sets out a process where we need to give our best estimate of the likely inflation. So that will probably be the specific types of inflation that impact our different cost base. But we will need to provide, as understandably, the detailed evidence, which will be assessed by the DfT and their advisors before a final decision is made.
I see. So a bespoke inflationary measure rather than an off-the-shelf. Okay, that's really useful. Thank you. Just back to what I was thinking about before with this top-up and true-up business. Obviously, the benefit is that if passenger numbers fall, then that's the government's problem. The downside of it, obviously, does it remove an incentive for TfL to market services? I was talking to the people down at Croydon Tram, or London Tram, I believe we call it now, who felt that they have a great service they offer to passengers, and people could use it much more, and they would like to see some more marketing. So if TfL don't see the benefit of getting more bums on seats, does that is that a downside of that deal?
Absolutely not. And actually, and Christian and I have been holding a series of briefings for our colleagues to make sure they understand the deal. One of the key messages we've been giving them is exactly that. We still have a really big role to play to attract and welcome customers back to our network and increase ridership. Because firstly, that's why we're here. We want to give people sustainable travel options. That's our raison d'etre. But secondly, from a financial perspective, this settlement will come to an end. So we need to make sure we exit this point in March 2024 with the highest level of demand possible, such that we have financial strength and resilience post that date.
Good. Well, that's very positive. Sorry, you were going to...
Just to say, you have three people here who, probably the only three people in London whose smiles broaden when we see a packed tube carriage. So, you know, we very much want to see people using the network.
Brilliant. And actually, I mean, that takes me to the other end, actually. So that's very positive. I'm glad to hear that. So one of the issues, we're obviously very light on tube services in Croydon and Sutton, but one of the conversations I've been having with GTR rail services is that because of this, what looks like now a permanent sort of new lower level in passenger demand, it's led to some services on their network which were always a bit marginal, which now don't look viable. Are there any TfL services which are in that same boat where they were always a little bit questionable, and now with this new sort of 70-ish% passenger numbers, I'm seeing shaking of heads? That's positive.
No, we've been very clear, Assembly Member, throughout the pandemic. We absolutely maintained full service, and there were question marks, and I raised eyebrows over that through the early days, certainly, where people said, well, why are you driving around with thin air? And initially it was because we wanted to maintain social distancing, but precisely because we want to attract people back onto the system, I think it's really important to not rush into making cuts because there seems to be a new normal approaching. Now, obviously, if that really does become a very, very long-term thing, we might have to revisit that. But my professional advice is absolutely do not go around cutting service, because it's easy to do in the short term. You can do it, creates a headline, improves your bottom line temporarily. You regret it in the long term, and it takes a long time to put back in terms of recruiting drivers, adding back rolling stock, etc., etc. So no, the answer is we're not looking to cut service in the way that you've described.
Well, that's all very positive. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Well, that takes us on nicely to further questions, mainly now about the impact of the deal on what we as Londoners will experience. So moving to Assemblymember Sheikh for the next set of questions. Assemblymember Doig, do you want to turn off your microphone just in case of feedback?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning to the panel. It's great to have you join us. So as the Chair mentioned, sort of moving on to the idea of how services will be impacted and the experiences of passengers, wanted to ask what are your thoughts on the outcomes for passengers from the deal?
I mean, I might go first if I may. I mean, the main and most obvious manifestation, Assembly Member, is that we've avoided those draconian cuts. We were not sabre rattling. Some said that we were not. We were facing the equivalent of 18% cuts on the buses, 18%, and 9% cut on the tube, which would have been quite disastrous, and I think the city would have been reeling from such cuts. So the main headline is that we have avoided those. We can now push on and get back to what we should be doing, which is planning for the future. Now, obviously, as I mentioned at the start, the deal wasn't as much in terms of quantum or as long in duration as we would have wanted, so we're not suddenly able to say all of the projects are back on track. We can't reinstate Crossrail 2, we can't reinstate Bakerloo Line Extension, not yet. There's still compelling cases, but we've avoided those calamitous cuts that would have otherwise been necessary, and I think that's the main manifestation, plus the fact that, as I just mentioned to Assembly Member Garrett, we're not looking to cut service. So I think on the whole it's a very positive story.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that.
There's not there's not much to add. Obviously, you combine it with the Commissioner's previous answer that the removal of those services would have made it very much harder to reinstate them in better times, and that's it's a huge win for London that we've avoided that.
No, I'm pleased to hear that. I mean, it would be good, I guess, to have a little bit more analysis from you on that side of the effects on passengers. So if, you know, someone who's previously obviously been an active traveller in London prior to the circumstances of COVID and then the negotiation of the deal, what will be the change in their experiences consequently from the deal? So a little bit more on that would be helpful.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify opportunity cost. That's the difficulty. So we're hypothesizing a scenario whereby you see 100 bus routes cut, you see the equivalent of a tube line removed from service, which there's a compounding element here as well, where people have a less good experience of their public transport network. They're less likely to use it, which means there are fewer users, which means there's less revenue, and so on and so forth. You end up in a very difficult position, exactly a downward spiral. So, that is the hypothesis. Now, in terms of looking forward, obviously the fact that we have some certainty in terms of our financial envelope and what we're able to do means that the MTS can continue, the Mayor's transport strategy can continue. That means that the overall target, as I mentioned earlier, of 80% remains, and it means that things like improving capacity, investing in new rolling stock, schemes to encourage and promote active travel across our city, step-free access to stations and facilities and other accessibility programs as well become feasible. All of that means that there can now be some certainty for Londoners that the transport system will not degrade and that the possibility of improvement is now there.
Fantastic, thank you, Seb. I think.
May I just add one final point? It was always the big prize, right? Which is why we were so tenacious about it. So yes, it was grueling, it was frustrating, it was exhausting, but it was worth sticking at because my personal view is that deal saved TfL. It sounds like hyperbole. It wasn't. This was an existential issue that had we not got a deal, the only alternative would have been heading down the Section 114 route, and worse, we would have ended up probably handing over the keys to central government. That would have been a very uncertain future for Londoners. So we had to get that deal. We had to get it for Londoners. We had to get it for our colleagues. We had to get it for myriad reasons. We had to get that, which is why it was always one of my top two priorities. It was an absolute must get, and we just stuck at it. And I'm very proud of the team that delivered it.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think we're all very proud of that team. And particularly helpful to have accessibility programs becoming more feasible highlighted, Seb, because I think in particular there was a lot of disabled Londoners campaigns around the effects of what could potentially be cuts to services and the impact on them. So hopefully we'll be mitigating those with this deal going forward. I wanted to ask specifically about fare rates. So what assumptions are made about fare rates within the deal, and when will fares announcements be made?
So as you know, the Mayor makes a decision on an annual basis as to what the fare rate should be. I mean, obviously, in terms of looking at this Mayor's record, the fares freeze is a huge part of encouraging people onto the network. And it was only we moved away from the fares freeze very reluctantly, obviously, as a result of the circumstances that we found ourselves in with the pandemic. Fares are obviously much lower as a result of the fares freeze than they would otherwise have been. That's an important point to make. But there are a number of assumptions that are made based on the projected fare rises for national rail increases, but we obviously don't know what the government's decision on those will be, but they will form obviously a part of the consideration that the Mayor takes into account. But I don't know, Patrick, if you want to say more about the financial assumptions on that basis.
Yes, so the funding settlement is predicated on the assumption that the Mayor decides to match national rail fare increases. And the planning assumption set out in the funding settlement is that national rail fare increases increased by 4% in March of both years of the funding settlement. However, the DfT were very pains to point out that is a planning assumption, and the Secretary of State will confirm the national rail fare increases in due course. But as the Deputy Mayor said, the decision for TfL fares is a decision reserved to the Mayor. And the funding settlement works that if the Mayor decided to match those increases, we will receive the funding set out in the funding settlement. If the Mayor decided to go higher, we would receive that benefit, but if the Mayor decided to go lower, our funding will be reduced accordingly.
Okay, thank you. And just building on the sort of specificities of different passengers and the fares, you've been asked to cover the cost of any over 60 and under 18 concessions outside the agreement. Is this possible?
So we believe that the actions that the Mayor took previously, given this has been an existing condition since the start of the pandemic, is sufficient to cover the cost of those concessions. And it's something we'll be monitoring as part of the oversight group to ensure that's the case.
That's good news. And lastly, how will this agreement impact TfL staff's pay?
There is a provision within the deal that talks about the funding settlement, I should call it, the funding settlement that talks about TfL should follow national or government pay policy. But the definition of what that is proving to be quite difficult to pin down. We asked DfT specifically, please define what you mean by public pay policy, and we have not yet had a definitive answer. So I can't really say any more than that, other than we will obviously continue to negotiate with our unions when deals, existing bargaining deals become expired in the normal fashion. But we've yet to ascertain exactly what is meant by public pay policy.
But can you anticipate any specific changes?
No. Put it this way: if what you're concerned about is will this lead to pay cuts for staff, absolutely not. We would not have agreed to it had that been the case. I set a series of tests for this deal, 5 tests, and one of them was deliberately that it should be fair to my colleagues, to TfL employees. Had there been something within that proposed agreement that said everyone's got to take a massive pay cut or a pay cut at all, or have their pensions slashed, I would have not recommended it to the board.
Fantastic.
On a point of principle.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Chair.
Zoning Member Baker, you have a question?
Yeah, I've just got a follow-up question that didn't ask earlier on finances because it crossed over, and Patrick, you've answered it a little bit. It's about the sort of interaction of passenger levels and fares, and you've explained how the fares. I'm assuming that you have modelled the additional funding gap that would be created if the Mayor froze the fares or raised them less than the government intends to. Can you share that modelling with the committee?
We've not yet completed that modelling at this stage because we do need to understand what the national rail fare increase, both the quantum and the timing of that increase, to complete that modelling. Once that's understood, as normal, we'll go through the process of providing advice to the Mayor, and the Mayor will make his decision.
Thank you. So I'm really concerned personally about fare rises and what it does to passenger numbers and usage. And it feels very much like as you've said, fare rises are sort of built in, and any decisions that are made for the good of Londoners and transport over funding, then we're going to have to find London's going to have to find the money for it. So just during the previous fare freeze from 2017-21, London Overgrown was one of the only 4 main train operators that actually saw passenger numbers rise. Would you expect a similar thing to happen would you expect the opposite to happen if we raise fares higher? Sorry, I'm not making sense, am I? You know what I mean? What's going to be the impact if we raise fares higher or lower than what's been assumed in the planning in terms of passenger numbers? And what would be the impact then on finances?
So it is very difficult to say given the unprecedented times we're in. So we have a fantastic fares and ticketing team in TfL, and we've got a very robust data set going back to 1970 of all the different fares impacts that we've seen over that period of time that informs our modelling going forward. The challenge we've got now is that we have 2 fundamental shifts. So firstly, the pandemic has increased the discretionary nature of travel for some people, and therefore our hypothesis is that the demand elasticity of fare increases will have increased, particularly for those user groups. Secondly, the economic conditions that we're currently in are pretty much outside the parameters of our modelling, certainly over the past 10 to 20 years, both in terms of the general level of inflation and the differential between inflation and earnings growth. So all those things are likely to mean a higher demand response from a fares increase, particularly if it's above earnings, and particularly if it's above other alternatives.
Sorry, just to pick up on what you said about fares increases being baked in. I mean, they're part of the funding settlement in the sense that if the Mayor doesn't decide to increase fares in line with national rail increases, then we would have to find the money elsewhere. But just to make it very clear, it's the Mayor's decision, and he would take that into account, but absolutely no decision on fare rises is baked in.
Absolutely. I meant the planning assumption was baked into the money that has been given. No, absolutely, totally understand. So, yes, it's just that, the concerns about, especially at what you said about it being, passenger numbers being even more dependent on fares. It's a real concern. Is there anything you wanted to add, Andy? Or?
No, I mean, we're very mindful of elasticities, but as Patrick said, that whole model has just become a whole bunch more, or a whole load more complex because of the factors that Patrick described. But there is a tipping point, and you can't keep gouging customers for more and more fares. A, that's immoral, and B, it's counterproductive because you would end up losing more people than you gain.
And apologies, I think you've probably given this in different bits of answer. What's the timetable for decision making on this? So obviously you'll be doing modelling from now until a decision's made, and then that's after the government's announcement of the national fare increases, yeah?
Yes, I mean, we can start doing some modelling now, and we are, based upon the new realities that we now face. But we are still waiting to hear what the government will want to do on any national fare rise. So at least if you're doing the work in advance, you've done some of that homework on the changed realities in advance of then factoring in what the figure is, the quantum, the percentage, and then we can come up with our analysis and make appropriate recommendation to the board.
Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Rogers, you also have a question.
Thank you. Just going back briefly to concessions, do you yet know when 60-plus Oyster cards and Freedom Passes will be usable before 9 a.m? I don't know who wants to take that one.
So the decision will be made very soon. I appreciate you've heard that, and it's not the answer you want in terms of wanting an answer now, but a decision will be made very soon. Obviously, it was one of the measures that we had to reluctantly introduce to try and claw back some revenue because of the pandemic. So whether or not that becomes a permanent feature because of the need to address the funding gap we still have, it remains to be a decision.
So by very soon, do you have anything more specific?
I definitely don't want to put a date, but perhaps I can borrow Andy's terminology, by the end of the year.
Okay. And one of the decisions is whether to bring it back at all.
It is, absolutely. It is, unfortunately, still a decision that whether or not to bring it back. It is very much up for consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Assemblymember Pigeon.
Saying by the end of this year, do you mean the calendar year?
Calendar year. I'm confident that we will have a decision by the end of the calendar year.
Okay, and you're saying on the table is still the option of allowing use before 9:30, but I understand that discussions with boroughs have confirmed that you are not going to allow use before 9:30 in the morning.
So, as I say, no decision has been made, but the rationale here is obviously that there are far fewer people using the 60-plus card for work. Now, that doesn't include everybody. Of course it doesn't. There are people who do, and there are people who use it to get to appointments at hospitals. We're very aware of the impact on different groups. Obviously, removing or watering down any concession is not something we would do with enthusiasm, but purely out of necessity. The conversation with boroughs is really to determine what that impact will be in various communities. It's not to predetermine a final decision.
Okay, and just to be clear, you talked earlier about the whole fares package. Did you say it's March rather than January that the fares will go up? Because that's a change in recent years. It used to always be January, about the 4th, 5th, 6th of January, and people would rush to get their annual travel cards. I realise that's a different era, and people don't have travel cards in the same way now. But is it March? Because it used to always be October we got the Mayor's fares decision. So are we looking more likely to be December for a March date? And if that's so, will the Freedom Pass 60 plus pass be part of that fares decision package, or will it be a separate decision?
In terms of your first part of the question, so again, the planning assumption set out by the DfT in the funding settlement is that national rail fare increases take place in March.
Right.
For
So
23.
that's a kind of shift, isn't it? 'Cause it always was
It is a
January.
shift from pre-pandemic
Yes.
precedent. Over the past 2 years, it has been March.
Yeah.
I think that might inform their planning assumption, but we are waiting to hear the decision from the Secretary of State.
And the mayors will be alongside that March rather than January.
There are some very strong technical reasons about aligning the two fares changes, given our fares are so interrelated. So that's a reasonable expectation.
So your decision's more likely to be December than October.
I think we should probably confirm the timeline in writing to you. It's because of the change, the fact as you rightly say, we'd normally do January, but now the government changes the fares in March. And because, as Patrick's just said, it's actually technically very difficult to do them separately because you've got to upload the fare tables, etc., etc. We're just working out the logistics, and I suggest we write to you once we've concluded our thinking.
And the timeline for the Freedom Pass 60
Sure.
plus pass.
We'll see if we can incorporate that within the
you.
same answer.
Okay, back to me, and I have a question about fares as well. Earlier on, I think it was Seb mentioned that part of the revenue raising options was the withdrawal of from the travel card agreement. And I just wanted to ask probably Andy or Patrick to just explain very briefly how that's a revenue raising option. Is it the case that under the travel card agreement, which is fairly ancient, we are effectively subsidising the train operating companies by giving them more money out of our travel card receipts than actually services they provide? Is that the basic assumption there, that that's why it's a revenue raising option?
Broadly, that's correct. I think the first thing to say is that the Mayor's not taken a decision to withdraw from the travel card agreement. It was a area.
It's an option.
He asked us to explore further. We're having some very active discussions about that at the moment. But the underlying hypothesis is broadly, as you say, that we believe the way the travel card apportionment mechanism works slightly disproportionately benefits train operating companies versus TfL. There are some secondary considerations in terms of financial impact. So the paper tickets are inherently more have an inherent higher potential for fraud than a contactless or an Oyster card, and there's a higher administration cost in processing and managing those paper tickets. So it's a combination of those three factors we think would give rise to a financial benefit, but it clearly is a change to our customer proposition, so we need to think through that very carefully, which is what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, that's really interesting. We'll probably have some further questions about that. Now, I see that in the letter in February about the funding agreement, there was a requirement from the DfT that Transport for London will provide an impact assessment on different passenger groups of the withdrawal from the travel card agreement. And then the deadline for that was the 29th of April. Was that assessment completed, and can we have it?
I don't believe that the EcoA was completed in full, partly due to the delays in the funding sessions we've had and the way the extensions and the short-term extensions we've had over the summer and spring. I believe we gave some high-level assessment at that stage, but we're committed to a more full assessment before making a final decision. I'm sure the final assessment will be published if any decisions are taken on the back of it.
Broadly, we'd expect that assessment to be positive for most protected groups, wouldn't we? Is that the broad assessment that came out?
I think the simple explanation is that it's very complicated and it's not quite as straightforward as you might think. That's why we're taking the time to do the detailed work.
Okay. Would you be able to provide us with what you already have done, though?
I'd have to check on that one.
I mean, my advice would be it's better that we give you the final report, because the very nature of what we've done today is the thinking is not yet concluded. But you know, you've asked a legitimate question in wanting to know where it is and can you see it. And once we've concluded it, I see no reason why we wouldn't share it with Assembly members. You have a legitimate right to have a look at it. But
Okay.
I think it's better that we finish it first, is my advice.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. And then just staying very, very broad, roughly how much of our income the receipts that we take for travel cards within TfL, do we actually then redistribute to the TOCs? I've tried to reverse engineer this, but it's very hard to work out.
It's not quite as straightforward because it goes into a pooling mechanism and then it's redistributed from that pool. Our initial estimate of the potential benefit of withdrawing from the travel card agreement was between 40 and 60 million pounds per annum.
Okay, that's worth having. That's a set of bus cuts, isn't it? So let's think about that further. And Assemblymember McCartney has a question.
Yeah. Can I just ask, if TfL did withdraw from the travel card, what would that mean for contactless payments? I'm thinking about, I use Network Rail services and then join the tube. Would I still be able to use my phone, or would there be ticketing issues?
Well, although for contactless and pay-as-you-go, that would be sorry, start again. What we've seen over a number of years is a shift from paper travel cards to people using Oyster, pay-as-you-go, and contactless, because they're a more convenient option for the vast majority of our customers. Not necessarily all of them, which is why the EQIA is important. So that premise wouldn't change. The daily and weekly capping that we provide would still be the underlying customer proposition for most customers. But it's those people that choose to buy a paper travel card for a day, a week or a month, it's those customers that will be impacted.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have further discussion about that as a committee later. Right, so moving on now to Assemblymember Pigeon, who has more questions.
Lovely, thank you. I want to pick up the issue of active travel and borough funding. So how much money is going to be available for active travel, and how does this compare to the figure from the 2019 business plan? Who would like to pick that up? Patrick, you got the figures? Lovely.
Yeah, so I'll start with the numbers. So in terms of funding for active travel in this funding settlement, there are two relevant streams. So within the capital envelope, there is a £80 million a year for this year and next year to fund capital active travel schemes. The precise wording of the condition is that it needs to be an average of £80 million a year, because there might be slightly more next year and slightly less this year, given the timing of the funding settlement. The other relevant condition and other relevant funding is within the operating envelope. There's a requirement for us to maintain borough funding at last year's level, which was 69 million. We anticipate a significant majority of that funding would support active travel and active travel related initiatives. So that gives us a broad quantum of around about £150 million a year going into active travel. We will shortly be submitting our proposals for how that money breaks down to our TfL Programmes and Investment Committee, which I think is next week, so you should see more detail on that relatively shortly.
Okay, how does this compare to the 2019 business plan? So you're saying about 150 million per annum.
Well, I can give you the figures, but I think firstly, it's really important to understand the different context of our current financial position to our pre-pandemic position. So in the 2019 business plan, we forecast passenger income, which as we all know is our predominant funding source and we're very heavily reliant on it, to be 6 billion for this year and 6.4 billion for next year. Our latest forecast is for 4.3 billion this year and 5 billion next year. There's been a structural reduction in our passenger income, our main income source, of £1.5 billion per annum. But as Andy said, we're very proud that actually we haven't responded to that with major service reductions, and we see that as a key priority. So therefore, the consequence is that there is less funding available for investment in a post-pandemic model, and as a result of this funding settlement. So the 2019 business plan did set out, I haven't got the precise numbers, around about 410 million of active travel funding for this year, and I think 280 for next year. But we can confirm to you that in writing afterwards.
Okay, so considerable reduction. I understand your financial position, of course I do, but significantly lower. Is the funding that you're allocating sufficient to meet the Mayor's target that Seb started with of 80% of all journeys on foot, cycle or public transport by 2041? Maybe actually I should go to Seb on that.
I don't think on its own it is, but obviously it's an important part of meeting that. So, as we say throughout, there is still a funding gap with this deal. We shouldn't, and we haven't said that this is going to deliver everything that we need, but it is an important step from what I mentioned, the opportunity cost earlier, from what could have been a complete inability to invest in any of these schemes. So the 80 million will be important. It's separate, obviously, to the overall funding as well that goes to boroughs. So it's treated separately. And I think that, again, that's an important part of ensuring that the money is delivered directly for schemes that deliver active transport and build the infrastructure that's necessary for that. But we will have to work creatively with boroughs and with other stakeholders to push forward with other schemes that might not be possible within that 80 million envelope. Obviously, it's impossible to kind of imagine up what that would look like in totality, but I'm sure we would want to work with Assembly members as well to identify what those opportunities are. But certainly I don't see it's a necessary but not sufficient step forward in delivering that target.
And in terms of working with the boroughs, I mean, the boroughs, obviously 95% of the road network boroughs. Outer London, we need to get more people cycling, need more investment in infrastructure there to make it a more palatable option for some people, a safer option for some people in terms of how they perceive it. But what impact does this agreement have on that borough funding through the local implementation plan process particularly?
So there is 69 million pounds was provided in 21-22, and the settlement letter makes it very clear that the LIP funding should be maintained at that level. I hope that's answered your specific question on that. But
I think the real issue, so I've tried to chat to some boroughs. So Richmond have come back to me, and they say they're being offered 45% of their pre-COVID LIP. So how are they supposed to be ambitious when there's limited funding? Are you expecting boroughs to supplement it? Is this now the new norm? This is where it's going to settle for the next few years? How and what out of this 80 million on top of the 69 million, how much of that is going to be for boroughs to spend rather than TfL choosing?
I mean, just firstly on your broad point, is this the new normal? I mean, this is the reality that we have now, obviously. But I mean, I put myself on the optimistic side of the ledger that things can change very quickly. If you think back just a few years, it was a very different environment. There's no reason to think that in a few years' time it couldn't be different in a much more positive way. So I wouldn't say this is the new normal going forward from now until the end of time. But clearly we are operating in a very severely restricted environment financially, and we have avoided the most catastrophic outcome, but we are certainly not in a situation where finances are where they were pre-pandemic, far from it. So yes, it is unfortunate that boroughs have their funding restricted from various angles, and this being another one of them. But obviously I would hope that people recognise that we're in a much better situation than we would have been had we not had this funding deal. I mean, it's incomparable, frankly. In addition, of course, to measures to actively increase infrastructure for cycling in inner and outer London, we do, of course, need macro-level changes to the way in which people view their transport options, which does, of course, mean a reduction in private car use where appropriate and an increase in public transport provision where alternative options are not yet available. And that longer-term goal should be maintained and is being maintained in the current financial climate, but should also, of course, look to a changed financial climate potentially in the future where the increase of options in outer London where there are currently far fewer alternatives must be a very important part of that planning process. If you reduce the amount of unnecessary car journeys on the roads, freeing capacity for people who do need to use the car, you obviously also make the road safer for walking and cycling. And that is a very much more cost-effective way of delivering than simply improving infrastructure, though, of course, that is an important part of the picture as well.
And the 80 million capital, how much is that is going to be available to the boroughs? Is there a process for them to be able to bid for that? And actually, should you, be thinking about allocating more to outer London, where actually we need to start seeing that step change more than inner London, particularly as you may or may not be going ahead with ULEZ expansion. You know, you've got to make, you know, some of the roads in outer London, you know, are frightening to cycle on. Some people do. Neil, I know, is a keen cyclist, but actually, you know, you've got to help change the infrastructure to make it a viable option. So how much of that 80 million is going to be available to boroughs, and when will that process be made transparent, clear?
Thank you. I can pick up both of those parts. So in terms of the 80 million, as we said at the start, the funding deal is still prescriptive. Although we're able to agree with the DfT some relaxations in the initial proposal, there are still some quite tight constraints about how money can get allocated. So those two envelopes, this operating envelope and the capital envelope, do constrain our ability to allocate funding in this regard. The capital 80 million can only be spent on investment which we can capitalise, which needs to be assets that we can control directly. So the vast majority of borough expenditure, unfortunately, does not meet that accounting test, because by definition, the borough own and control those assets. So therefore, I don't believe very much, if any, of that 80 million will be able to be used to top up borough investment.
Okay,
And that's
well,
why
you're
this
just to be clear, I want this on record. So the Cycling and Walking Commissioner is telling boroughs that this pot of money can be used by boroughs, and what you're saying is actually pretty much it can't.
Well, we'll be working with the boroughs to make sure that we're delivering schemes on our road network, or where we can capitalise on their schemes, to make sure that we're meeting borough priorities as well as ours. But
it's TfL road network in those boroughs rather than their network.
Predominantly. There are a few minor exceptions where we can capitalise expenditure on borough-controlled assets, but it is the exception rather than the rule. Old assets, but it is the exception rather than the rule. The second part of your question in terms of outer London, so we are currently engaging with boroughs about a change to the formula we've used since the previous mayor to allocate LIP funding. And one of the rationales for that is exactly what you've said, that in terms of the new mayor's transport strategy, focused around creating mode shift, creating that growth in particular in outer London, we are considering a different way of distributing that funding, but we are still in discussions with boroughs about how that could work.
I think that will be welcomed by outer London. I know when you talk to boroughs like Sutton, you know, they get the lowest of any, and they don't have the tube and they don't have the overground. So, and all these boroughs are now starting to get bike hire schemes and so on. So you need to have that investment in the infrastructure to get that modal shift. So I look forward to seeing more detail, but I really would urge you to get some clarity out to the boroughs, because they are starting to think that this 80 million may well be available for their roads, and pretty much from your finance point of view, that's not going to be possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So moving on to buses now. I know the bus cuts question was touched upon earlier on, but can you clarify what this deal means for bus cuts? I know that there is a set of bus cuts that were consulted upon during the summer that you haven't yet made a decision on. Can you tell us, if you can, whether there will be a decision on that one way or the other, and what timing there will be for that decision, but also whether any other bus cuts are in scope? I note that you're still trying to save £90 million this year and £140 million in future years. Is that going to come off the buses or not?
So I'll kick off, if I may, Chair. It's important to differentiate between what we avoided and what is still possible. So what we avoided was the 18% draconian calamitous cuts to which I referred earlier. That's separate from the 4% bus reduction, bus mileage reduction, or bus cuts, call it what you will, bus reduction in the bus network of 4% by 24-25. Now, that is what we're still consulting on. That doesn't mean to say the die is cast. We're still doing, we're analysing the results of the consultation that happened, and we're being very careful to understand the consequences of any changes that might then ensue. So typically what we're talking about is typically central London, where there is already a very, very high level of bus provision. In some cases, a bus literally every 15 seconds. So if you take a bus out, I'm thinking of the likes of Holborn or other places that are intensely trafficked, customers wouldn't really notice a difference. But we have not yet concluded that that thinking. In answer to your point about time frame, soon. I'm sorry, that's a little vague, but we want to get this right, and we're still ploughing through the results of the consultation at the moment. But that's what's still on the table. That's different from the original, the 18% that we talked about earlier.
Okay, so the committee took quite a strong line on in its response to the proposals over the summer. Essentially, we said the impact of the changes on Londoners is disproportionately large compared with the amount of money which will be saved. We don't think that bus cuts we think they're counterproductive, effectively. Now, we got a response back to that just a few days ago from the Director of Public Transport Service Planning, Jeff Hobbs, who came to the meeting to talk to us about it. And that letter says, we note the committee's position. However, we are confident that the proposed reduction in the kilometres operated on the bus network appropriately responds to the requirement to find savings and both past and expected future travel patterns. So effectively, that letter, although it isn't saying that there's a decision, in fact it says there hasn't been a decision yet, it is making the case for bus cuts as a good thing in their own right. And is that something you stand by? Because, like I say, the committee, in the evidence that it heard from passengers, from disabled persons groups, from the people who live in the areas that are at the end of all those bus routes that overlap on a few streets in the middle of London, was very clear that this was going to do more harm than good.
Which is why it's not yet concluded. So I don't think there's any difference between my position and that of Jeff. We're both transport professionals, so wholesale cuts are anathema to us. That's not why we do this. We believe in public transport. We believe in decent and effective public transport which encourages people to use the service. But because we're also realistic and there is finite funding, we should always look to to keep services under review. If, for example, a route is just not being used, or it's duplicated, and there's a perfectly good alternative running along the exact same route that means you wouldn't have to wait very much longer at all, a matter of seconds, then because this is not our money, it's public money, and there's an opportunity cost to not using that money for something else, we do keep these things under review. So some tweaking of the bus network on a regular basis, I think, is a good thing. It should be dynamic. It's not set in stone forever, because you could argue it both ways. If it was set in stone forever, you could never increase the capacity if you didn't have a review mechanism. But that is what we're talking about. We are still evaluating those responses, and we're very mindful of your view and the people that you represent. And what we're not about to do is massively disadvantage a particular community. There are a number of factors that are filters, lenses through which we will consider the proposed changes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, to be clear, I mean, this isn't tweaking or moving something from central to outer London. This was an overall reduction in bus kilometres that you were discussing there. But I'll hand over now to Assemblymember Garrett, and then a few other supplementaries from other members.
Thanks. I have a bus question, but actually, I first of all just wanted to pick up on this question that Assemblymember Pidgeon sort of emerged in her questions about active travel schemes not on TfL roads, because just to be very parochial for a moment, I think I'm right in saying in my vast GLA constituency, I think there are only 3 TfL roads, and as a cyclist I actively avoid all 3. They're some of the worst places to cycle in the entire borough of Croydon and Sutton. I'll give you an example, the A232 goes through Sutton. Part of it isn't even wide enough for 2 buses to pass. So the idea that you could somehow create space there for cycling infrastructure is obviously for the birds. So what what I heard, and I'm offering you an opportunity to tell me that I'm wrong, which I hope I am, what I heard from what you just said is that both Croydon and Sutton are constrained in the funding they get from TfL. If they want to put in cycle facilities, they can only put it on A232, which is east-west, and the A23 and the A22 north-south. If they want to put TfL-funded schemes on other roads, which, you know, based on my local knowledge, I think the only place they'd be viable is mostly on other roads, they can't use that money for that. Have I misunderstood? Please tell me I have.
So I think I can clarify that. So, as I said, there are two funding streams, so we start from that basis. So the 69 million of borough funding can be used broadly within the borough's discretion, albeit within the guidelines that we set. So that investment is there to make improvements in borough roads, absolutely. The issue I was discussing with Assembly Member Pigeon is that the 80 million of capital funding has a level of constraint on, because we need to make sure that we meet the conditions in the funding settlement, that it has to be capital. And therefore we need to make sure we can meet our accounting tests, that any investment on borough roads can be legitimately capitalised by TfL. The accounting rules around that are quite complex. It's a relatively unique situation where two bodies are funding assets whilst under restriction of these CapEx and OpEx rules. So the test is, does TfL have sufficient control over that investment for us to capitalise it? In the main, that is difficult when we are funding borough investment on borough roads, because our ability to control it is limited. There are some exceptions. The two main ones are on bus measures, because it forms part of our bus network. The economic benefit flows through to TfL, and in the main, that investment can be capitalised. There are some cycling investment on borough roads where we can capitalise it. But the critical test is it forming part of an integrated network that is the asset, and we can capitalise that asset as a whole, which is in part on borough roads. So we're looking at the level of connectivity between that borough cycle lane investment and a TfL cycle route. Where we can demonstrate that can often be capitalised. And finally, there are some conditions that the borough can agree to in terms of protecting that asset on our behalf and not changing it or withdrawing it without our express permission. In those instances, we can meet that accounting test. And I think that's probably the difference between what you heard from the Cycling Commission and me. They're describing the same issue, that there's a constraint. We will maximise that flexibility wherever we can to make sure that we make the best investments. But all I'm saying is that there are some constraints around that which will limit our ability to provide all the 80 million for borough roads, for example. But there is some flexibility, and we will use that. Okay. We are setting out more details on the overall programme of Healthy Streets very shortly. I think the papers might even get published in the next day or so, which will outline that in more detail. So we'll make sure that's shared with the committee. And if there is any discrepancy with what I said and Will said, we'll make sure we clarify it with both yourselves and the boroughs.
And where does that constraint come from?
That around the 80 million, well, it's twofold. So the government have prescribed it has to be used for capital.
Okay.
And secondly is the accounting rules about what can be counted as a capital.
I see. Okay. It's just that it would seem perverse to people that if you build the exact same piece of infrastructure on this road, that's fine, and on that road, TfL can't fund it as capital. But
accounting rules are often perverse.
Yes. No. I'm sensing that. Okay. Well. Anyway, back to the question I was going to ask, which was back on buses, which was the current topic. So quite some time ago now, there was the Croydon and Sutton bus review, which has been parked, if I can use a horrible pun, for a long time. And whenever inquiries were made, it was parked because we were waiting for the deal, which we now have. So when is it grinding into first gear and moving forwards?
I think the technical term is it's laying over. But,
is that what it's doing?
Yes. I'll have to take that in, come back to you, Assembly Member. I don't have that detail, but we will get a response back to you on when that will be finalised.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was it. Thanks, Chair.
Great, thank you very much. Assembly Member Baker.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just want to return to a subject that I've touched upon in a couple of previous meetings around the bus consultation, which is around equality impact assessments. So there obviously was a very, very extensive equality impact assessment for the bus consultation, But my concern, and I raised this in our June meeting with Andy Lord, was there some assessment of the equality impact, even if it wasn't a formal equality impact assessment, before choosing to offer cuts to the buses as a measure to reduce costs? Because obviously what I'm concerned about is that we're heading into a situation where a whole number of measures are going to have to be considered, considering the savings, the cuts that you have to make, and are those, is that going to be assessed in terms of the impact on most disadvantaged people in London before it's decided whether that might be buses, tubes, something over here that doesn't affect services at all? Does that make sense?
I mean, if it puts your mind at rest, Assembly Member, we absolutely take our EQIA assessments, the process, we take it seriously because we are talking about real people. So we do, in any change, particularly where it results in a reduction in service offered, we do look at all the various spectrums of the demography or demographic which we're serving, to look at what would the impact be on elderly users, people with disabilities, women and girls. So all of those factors are considered. And that's certainly been the case with the proposed bus reductions. And I will, ultimately, if I'm still in post, I would have to be convinced that we have done that properly before I would agree to that. I'm sure that's the same for Andy Lord.
Yeah, absolutely. I have no doubt. I've seen the equality impact assessments on the bus consultation. They are rigorous. The problem is with them is that they say, yes, this is going to have a significant impact. And what I'm asking about is the step before that, because any impact on buses is going to have that impact on a whole range of groups who don't have other options. So the question is that the right decision? And if you did an equality impact assessment or something similar on the range of measures you could take to save money, I think that absolutely sure that some other measures would come up better in an equality impact assessment, formal or not. Does that make sense? That's what I'm asking about. It's the step before.
Understood.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can't claim to be an expert on EQIAs. It is a very rigorous and it's a very thorough process, and we can get you more detail. But the way I understand it, and certainly in my time as the Commissioner, the way we have discussed things as an executive, is you start from the basis of are there other ways that we can save money without impacting our customers? Because they're our raison d'etre, they pay our wages. That's what we're here to do. So that's why we have had, with a lot of success, a track record of reducing back office costs, bureaucracy costs, shaving money off contracts, all sorts of different things in order to absolutely mine that potential for savings before we even consider looking at impacts on customer service. That's only right? You look to every possible avenue before you look to adversely impact customers and by the services that they rely upon. And if, though, having done that process, you find that there is a need to look at services, certainly my view would be, and again, I'm not an expert on EQIA, if there is something that would be a knockout blow before you even start, then you should rule that out as a potential avenue for savings. If there was something that was materially deficient, for example, or detrimental, better word, detrimental to people with disabilities, then to me that's a no-no right from the start. So there are a number of filters through which you apply, and or gates might be a better expression. If you've got through a certain gate and say, well, it can be looked at as a viable proposition for reductions, you still then have to go through that rigorous EQIA process before you make a decision that it will in fact become reality.
Absolutely. I understand. I have no doubt. I absolutely trust that the people making the decisions believe that they're investigating all other options, and back office cuts, as you say, are not easy. They impact a load of people as well, and I know you know that, so I'm not suggesting there are easy decisions to be made in any way. But the reason formal equality impact assessments exist is because they try and design out all the biases that all of us have when thinking this is easier than this, because we don't necessarily understand other people's lived experiences. And that's my concern, that because there's not any formal process, then a decision may be made that looks like it's the right one. But the fact is that choosing is the wrong word, but the decision that cuts to the buses were the right thing to do is always going to impact, for instance, disabled people disproportionately. Always. And it wasn't ruled out. So do you see what I mean? So I know it's a really difficult thing to do. I suppose what I'm asking is, and we did ask this previously, to ask about the process that was done prior to deciding that there would be a consultation on bus cuts. But more importantly now, what process you're going to go through to assess all those, the revenue raising options and stuff like that before deciding on something to then consult on it, which is then the stage where you have to do the formal EQI. Does that make sense in terms of what I think we should ask for? Sorry, that's a bit rude of me to ask on behalf of, but that's okay. Yeah. Would you be okay?
So I want to give you a wholesome answer on this. I'm not an expert. So why don't I take an action to get you a written summary of the process from start to finish? Because I think that's the best way to answer your question. And if you feel that process is deficient, please feel free to come back to us.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's really clear. We have tried to ask previously for the sort of the optioneering reports that compares the pros and cons. We haven't had that yet, so that would be really useful. Assemblymember Bailey, a quick question from you.
Thank you, Chair. Just to almost continue the conversation and respond to a comment made by the Commissioner, do you think it's acceptable then, when we're looking at bus cuts and how impactful they're going to be on people, that we still continue to not look to save money through the amount of facility time TfL does, for instance, or even through nominee passes, because we're keeping these benefits and we're cutting buses, and we've had a long explanation of how impactful that's going to be on some of the most vulnerable Londoners. Why aren't these situations being looked at? Why are we not looking at facility time, for instance, which I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that TfL has quite a large amount of facility time in respect to its size if you look at other government departments?
Sure. So, I mean, we do look at those. We look at all aspects of the cost base of our operation. But I think, again, there's a balance to be struck between if we said we are going to just savage employee benefits and savage employee release time, you've just got to be careful that you don't inadvertently have an unintended consequence. For example, that suddenly people say, well, okay, they're constantly attacking our benefits, we're going to leave. Now, what happens if that's a bus driver or someone who's facilitating the bus contracts, who is then not there to do that? That's somewhat counterproductive. And similarly, if we were to unilaterally say we're going to withdraw representatives' time, we'd probably end up with some measure of industrial action that would immediately impact the people about whom you're concerned. So it is getting a balance. And I think we have a pretty responsible record in this regard. My predecessor, I give him credit, not me, took out something like £1 billion in savings off the TfL cost base during his tenure, and a lot of that came from backroom savings. So I think we do understand that point, but I think just looking to withdraw things from employees can be counterproductive.
But I never use the term savage or withdraw. What I'm saying is, why aren't we looking at the size of these things? We are now talking about bus cuts, and you made the point that TfL's raison d'etre is to provide service to its users. Are these things being looked at, nominee passes, facility time, are they being looked at with the same level of rigour that bus cuts are being looked at?
And I do apologise. I didn't mean to put words in your mouth. The issue of the employee pass and the nominee pass has been looked at in the past, and the actual nominee pass is pretty negligible actually in terms of the amount that would save. It doesn't really cost us anything. There's a small element of revenue foregone. But we have looked at release mechanisms. We think we've got them right, but it's certainly something that we will keep under active review, because we do recognise that every penny we spend on ourselves is a penny not spent on customers. We do understand that.
How much money do we think these bus cuts will save that are being proposed?
I think the amount we're looking for is 35 million. 35 million.
And how much is the foregone revenue in nominee passes and the monies that we spend on facilities time?
Facilities, I'd have to come back to you on the revenue, the nominee passes. It's very hard to quantify because most people live outside the area, so they don't necessarily use the nominee pass very much internally. We've calculated potentially 7 million, but it's very hard to quantify because a lot of people don't use them. It's a guess.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, Chair, but I think you should make an attempt to quantify it because it costs money and we're in a very different time to when these things were proposed. And facility time, I'm sure you'll be able to get a very accurate figure because you should know where your staff are. But it'd be interesting for you to write to committee so we can understand the scale. Thank you.
Sorry, Assembly Member, the cost of facility time is disclosed in our account. So last year it was 7.1 million, which was 0.3% of our pay bill.
Okay, good. Well, these things add up and we could save a number of bus routes, I imagine. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Yes, it would be good to get an accurate figure on that because I know it's always contested at budget time. So, yeah, that would be really great. No, the nominee passes one is always, there's a bit of back and forth at budget time about what the actual number is. Right, members, that we're bang on time, so let's stay that way. And I'm just moving now on to questions about capital spending. I know we discussed a little bit of that around walking and cycling, but these are other questions and other projects too. So, Assembly Member Garrett to start us off on that.
Hello, yes, glutton for punishment. I'll have another question on capital. Just broadly now, taking the deal overall, how much extra capital funding is there now than that's been secured as part of the deal?
So this funding settlement provides for 3.6 billion of capital investment over this year and next. Our budget we published in March, prior to this deal, set out 3.4 billion of capital expenditure. So this funding settlement is allowing us to increase capital expenditure by 200 million. As I said in one of my first answers, the 1.2 billion of funding provided in the deal does break down with 800 million going to capital. However, 600 million of that replaces an assumption we had from a financing transaction on the sale and buyback. So actually, it's only 200 million pound of additional funding. But from a managed decline budget that had those really significant reductions on renewals and no new enhancements, that 200 million pound does make a big difference, albeit, as we've discussed before, in the ideal world, we would like more.
Okay, and actually, this might be, it's always a good question to ask. Do we know when we get that money? Is that available now, or is it available in a reasonable timescale over the capital programme, or is it one of those where the government gives us the money but hasn't actually given us the money?
It is phased broadly evenly over the 20-month period. There isn't, I think there's an annex that sets out the profile, but it's broadly even. And actually, the DfT collaborated with us to define that profile, so it worked for us. So I'm content we'll get the money as it's required.
Okay, great. When do you expect, now that we have the deal, when do you expect the next TfL business plan to be coming out, and what would be the time scale for that be? What, the time range for that business plan?
So we're really looking forward to this because it's our first business plan since 2019. It's our first post-pandemic business plan, which will can set out our future more clearly and give us the certainty, our colleagues and our stakeholders certainty about what we're doing. So the TfL business plan we aim to present to the TfL board on the 7th of December. But as ever, there's a close integration, and in fact they're pretty much identical to the submission we need to make into the Mayor's budget process, which I think the deadline is around the end of November. Under the Mayor's budget guidelines, we need to set out 4 years of financial information, so it will cover the period to 25-26.
Okay, and in terms of what's likely to be in that, the sort of pipeline of capital projects, what does that look like?
Well, that's what we're actually working through now. Okay. So after the 30th of August, we had about half a day off and then went straight into business planning. What it does allow us to do is to complete all the committed schemes that we had in flight. And that was another risk of receiving no deal, that we simply wouldn't have been able to complete the Piccadilly rolling stock order or the DLI new trains or the 4 lines modernisation programme. So that is the backbone of the business plan. As we've talked about, there's a degree of prescription over that 200 million capital funding through active travel, increased renewals and Crossrail. So within the 2-year funding period, we'll be prescribing in more detail how those pots get allocated. And then what we're doing is looking beyond that to see what assumptions we can make on further capital investment beyond that point.
Okay, so all of the capital, not to go through them in one by one, but all of the capital projects that we sort of vaguely know about, those are that were in the pipeline are continuing. There's nothing else sort of newly coming in.
No, so not quite. So what I just described is that for instance, the 200 million additional capital funding goes to new projects in this window.
Okay.
So it goes to those new active travel projects that we're going to outline in more detail. It goes to more renewals projects. So there are more projects we will be delivering in this 2-year funding period. And we'll also set out beyond that point, beyond the funding deal, what our further capital investment profile looks like.
Okay. In terms of that, if I can make a parochial bid, I've been doing some casework recently with people getting delays on the tram, which is the one bit of TfL rail we have in my patch. And the response that I had back was quite lengthy, but spoke about difficulties with older rolling stock, which I'm sure is not news to you. Also supply of wheels, which turned out to be surprisingly tricky. What are the odds of new tram rolling stock, either to increase the total capacity, or the issue is they need 30 trams on the track per day. And, you know, with the normal routine problems that you have with any operation, there's always a few that are out of service. And the total number that might potentially be available is dwindled. So what are the odds of that going into the programme?
I think it's important to manage expectations here. As we've said,
Yes.
in-flight projects we will finish off, and that's an upside of this deal because had we not got the deal, even in-flight projects might have ground to a halt, so that's good. But because of the delta we've talked about, the 200 million, and because that's further diminished by the fact that some of this is already earmarked, it's prescribed by government, our ability to add new projects is obviously somewhat constrained. But having said that, we are working our way through a methodical process, and that's the whole point of doing the business plan, which is great because we haven't done one for 3 years. That does take into account, to your point, on a prioritised basis, state of good repair of assets. So we're looking at roads, we're looking at relative state of rolling stock. Trams, as you rightly say, does have some issues. Bakerloo line trains are 50 years old. You know, they're still chugging along, but they can't last forever. So within a very finite, currently finite, won't be that forever. I agree with the Mayor. I'd like to think, Deputy Mayor, sorry, I'd like to think that we won't be in this situation forever. We will move to sunnier uplands. There will come a point where we are able to do more, but
Okay.
I should just manage people's expectations. Big ticket items are not on the horizon right now.
Okay. I mean, in terms of, you know, people being realistic and managing expectations, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but it's difficult to find anything on the list that is of any real benefit for any of the 500,000 people who live in my corner of London. We already have very few TfL services. And the future pipeline looks like, you know, taking your point about, you know, you can't magic money out of thin air. None of the stuff that's in the pipeline is really benefiting my residents. So, and what we did hear earlier today, there's a potential clawback from this travel card question. So people like me who travel into London from Croydon or Sutton, we use those mainline trains. So, you know, they're in a one-in, one-out system. So you said you're delighted that you don't have to cancel services. The conversation I had with GTR, services they're running is everything they can run. So the reason, for example, there's no Tatman Corner to Victoria service is because they just say they don't have the money to run it. So it's great that TfL deal allows TfL to avoid those kinds of cuts. You know, the meetings I have with GTR, they're not in the same position. Now I hear that you're clawing money back. You know, the tram is getting tired and there's no capital funding. So in terms of realistic expectations, the realistic expectation for people in Sutton and Croydon is they haven't got much and they're not going to get anything else.
I didn't say we're not going to spend money on the tram system. Clearly, we've got to keep it safe in a state of good repair. But to reassure you, we have not yet finished that process. As Patrick said, the business planning process is still ongoing, and we will aim to get the squeeze as much as we possibly can out of what we've currently got to play with.
I'll just add a couple of points to that. So just firstly, again, just to clarify the position on the travel card proposal. So, as we said, the Mayor's not made a decision on that yet. We're still working through the analysis. If we did decide to progress with that, if you're starting within a TfL zone, you have the benefit of pay-as-you-go and capping, so therefore you would not have a detriment. But there are a number of complexities which we're still working through.
In what sense would there not be a detriment? Would it not be that the rail fare goes up?
If you're within a TfL zone, subject to TfL's fares capping, that will stay the same.
I'm not sure what that means. Let's say someone's in Zone 6 and they pay a Zone 6 fare to go from somewhere in, say, Croydon into London Bridge. They would still pay the same fare. Is that what?
If they're benefiting from the current daily and weekly caps on TfL services, i.e. they're tapping in and out with their contactless card or contactless oysters, that's not using the travel card system.
Yes.
Therefore, that's not subject to any potential changes.
Okay.
So, Andy's absolutely right to be realistic. The one reason to be slightly optimistic in the medium term is that this funding settlement does recognise the need for ongoing capital support from government to TfL, specifically for things like rolling stock replacement and signalling, and it's a recognition that transport authorities around the world rely on that capital funding. The reason that we're not able to be specific at this point is that we need to engage with government to see what that looks like. But we will definitely be making the case that that is required in our rolling stock, and we'll be looking forward to that commitment being delivered on and further funding being brought through to TfL such that we can take forward those projects.
Great. So one final question from me. During the discussion about managed decline, there was a question...
Sorry, did the Deputy Mayor want to come in on that particular question just there?
Merely to say that, obviously, as Patrick's outlined there are, the deal doesn't mean that's the end of the conversation with government on capital projects. It means that there are very many more conversations with government on capital projects. But I should say that, if I may be so bold, the Assembly member has made an excellent case for additional funding from central government to train operating companies to ensure that the services that they directly run are on a par with TfL's.
Well, okay. I feel duty-bound to point out the report that came out in the previous term which showed that Sutton got less funding from this mayor than any other borough, and it could get twice as much and would still get less than any other borough. So I don't think it's entirely just the government on the hook for not having more stuff for Sutton or Croydon.
Sure, it's a reflection of the fact that the government runs the train services predominantly in that area. But yes, that's why it's important that we get the support from central government.
And all the stuff that TfL might do just keeps constantly getting cancelled, like the tram. There's an upgrade where two of those TfL roads meet at Purley Cross, a horrible junction, no plans to improve it, various discussions over time, always constantly scrapped. I wasn't going to go on to that, but thank you, Chair, for highlighting that. My final question, that was going to be my final question, was during the discussion about the managed decline process, one of the questions that came out, which became a bit of a news story in Croydon, was about the flyover, whether it was being properly maintained, whether it might, collapse or fall into disrepair. What's the status with that?
It's still safe because it's still in operation, but that plus a number of structures are on our watch list. And we have previously said, I'll reiterate it here, that were a structure to deteriorate to the point where our structural engineers had concerns about it, then there are a number of options, one of which is to introduce weight limits onto that structure, or in the worst case, it would have to be to close it while emergency repairs were carried out, but we're not in that state yet. I can get you more detail in a written response.
That would be something that wouldn't have happened in the last 18 months. If a flyover deteriorates to that point that you have to impose a weight limit, surely that's not an 18-month thing. That's a long-term
these are
problem.
things that are the result of, in some cases, decades of underinvestment because of lack of available funds. But we have very, very rigorous safety inspections of all of our infrastructure, be that railway infrastructure or road infrastructure, to make sure that users' safety is never put at risk. But over a period of time, infrastructure will degrade if you're not able to properly maintain it, or if it goes beyond its design life, and that's one of the factors with a lot of our structures. They're way beyond their design life. So there comes a point where you do have to introduce mitigation, and in the worst case that can be closure. We try to avoid that at all costs, but it's always with a view to safety first.
So that's a hypothetical answer about what would happen were deterioration to occur to that point.
Correct.
What is the current situation with the Croydon
That's where I
flyover?
said I would have to get you a written response. I mean,
Okay.
I'm aware there are issues there. I don't know the full detail. I'll get you a written
Thank you, I
response.
appreciate that. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member McCartney.
Yes, thank you. Again, with regard to the capital programme, I think you've said in relation to Assembly Member Garrett that the capital projects that are listed in the agreement, I think it's paragraph 7, have funding now in this settlement. Can I just check, Patrick, is there any extra borrowing that's required to fund those projects?
No, the projects listed are funded through the capital envelope provided and therefore do not require TfL borrowing.
Okay, thank you. Then can I ask about other projects? I don't want to add to Neil's wish list, but I've constantly asked about Piccadilly line signalling because we've got the new trains arriving in 2025, but we know to get that 60% upgrade in capacity, we need the signalling to go alongside it. And I think it was Andy, or it could have been Patrick, that just mentioned, but of course we are looking at government and talking, and they are alive to the issues of signalling. So can I just ask, is that something that is the currently being discussed with government?
Well, we discussed it during the funding deal, actually, and I made the point that it's a nonsense to have new trains and not benefit from new signalling, right? Because yes, the train is inherently nicer, it's more reliable, but you still don't benefit from the added capacity that moving block signalling would provide. So the current state of play is that the good news is the train fleet purchase is funded. So that's good news. And Andy Lord, my COO, incoming interim commissioner, went to have a look at the first one, the prototype, just the other day, and sent us this fabulous picture of what is beginning to look like a train. The first 3 carriages are linked together. It's a highly complex piece of kit. There's still various other bits to do on it, but it's on target for introduction. The first train, in fact, they're assembling the remainder of that train right now. So that's good news for Piccadilly line users. What's not so good news is that we have not yet got the funding for the signalling. Throughout the funding deal, we made the point, and on the broader issue, we made the point that this really does make sense, because to me this is levelling up, because guess what? That signalling system, those trains are not made in London. Yeah. They are made elsewhere. That's high quality, high tech, high paying jobs around the country. So we will continue to make the case for the signalling to complement the trains. It makes absolute sense, and in the as long as we're still using fixed block standard signalling, which is inherently increasingly unreliable. It's safe, but it's unreliable, and it's very resource intensive, and it's very hard to get hold of the spare parts. We are wasting money, so we've got to win that argument to get that line re-signalled such that you can have the intensity of service that you see on the likes of the Victoria line.
And how is government responding to those?
They get the logic, but it's all about money at the end of the day, right? We made a case for lots of other very compelling schemes as well. Crossrail 2, Bakerloo Line extension, pushing on with the step-free access. The people with whom we were discussing this, they get the logic, but equally, to be fair to them, they've got lots of demands on the National Exchequer. Everyone wants more money. So I think what we set out to fight our case and fight our corner tenaciously, but we knew we weren't going to win everything. But I think that one is one that we can win over time, because there's so much. It makes so much sense. Why would you buy a brand new set of trains to have them chug along on an antiquated signalling system? It makes no sense whatsoever. Let's maximise the utility of that new train service and transform the PIC, which at the end of the day is links our West End and other areas to London's primary airport and our global gateway.
Thank you. And can I ask, has government given any indication that once this the current capital funding has expired, what will come next? We'll be into those bids for the next 3-5 year settlements.
What we set out to achieve was obviously to get the deal to keep TfL going, which we did. Tick. We saved TfL. We got a deal that is okay, not quite the deal we were looking for, but 20 months, and it staved off the catastrophic doomsday scenario that we've described to you during this meeting and elsewhere. But what we also aimed to do was to get some comfort from government and some understanding that this isn't the end of the matter. You know, yes, we will achieve financial self-sustainability by March 23, which is a massive achievement and will be a remarkable turnaround from a £3 billion deficit to covering our costs on an operating basis day to day. That's a remarkable blue chip turnaround. But CapEx is a different matter. I can't think of any transit system in the world, maybe Hong Kong slightly different, that covers its CapEx costs. In fact, Hong Kong also needs central government or the legislative government's support. So we did get that understanding. There is a reference in the deal that says government does recognise that going forward there still will need to be capital support. And that's something that we'll need to get talking about fairly soon, because although we've secured 20 months, it's not such a long time. We need to get talking on that pretty soon and making that compelling case.
Yeah, and it would be nice if the Piccadilly line signalling could be one of the first in any new funding settlement, so that the new trains could have a decent track and signalling.
Well, you can rest assured Mr. Lord feels as strongly as I do about that. It will be right up there on the shopping list.
Thank you. And can I just check, and this is for either for Andy or Patrick, about the sale and buyback option that is specified in the deal, that you should stop that. Is that going to happen, and what impact will that have on TfL?
So yes, we will meet this condition and every other condition in the funding settlement, so we will not progress with the sale and buyback. I think just part of the context, the reason that our previous budget assumed that is because we had no other choice. We had these large capital projects, like the Piccadilly line trains, in contract, under construction, and no capital funding source. So we had to be creative, we had to look at options, and the budget had to assume that we would sell and buy back those work-in-progress trains that Andy just described to give us some short-term cash flow relief. We didn't want to progress with that because it's a complicated arrangement, it adds cost. The best way of funding these is for central government grant, and that's what we secured.
Thank you, that's helpful. Then my final question is about third-party funding, because the deal does talk about the fact that you have to pursue other third-party funding options. What are you looking at, and how hopeful are they? I'm going to ask Patrick for that one, I think.
Thank you. So yes, we already have been for several years pursuing third-party funding, because we have seen government funding decline from about 2015 onwards. So we're working with the GLA for two large packages of investment for the Housing Infrastructure Fund. So that's something we talked about for some time, but we're still in the process of getting the cheque from government to actually give us that funding, which partly got delayed on the DLR due to the hiatus in government over the summer, but we're now, hopefully the new Secretary of State can finalise the sign-off on the next phase of that investment. So they're two really big schemes that deliver housing benefits, deliver good growth, hardwiring sustainable public transport in there as well. We're also working with boroughs to make sure they can access as much funding as possible, because there are some funding pots, such as the Levelling Up Fund, as was. We'll see if that continues. That our ability to bid in was relatively limited, but we have supported a number of boroughs to make those bids where they're transport related, because we share that interest. We've been using collective resources to do so. And we will see what further funding becomes available, particularly from government, in the growth plan that was announced a few weeks ago. It did outline some priority capital projects the government was looking to accelerate. That included two TfL schemes that we're looking to progress with them and see what that actually means, whether that means more funding more quickly. We certainly hope it does. And then beyond that, we work with a range of developers to maximise the benefits of planning obligations and planning proceeds, again, to hardwire good growth in. We have a very good track record of receiving individually relatively small, but cumulatively very important proceeds as part of that process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That's all from that section. Apart from Caroline Pigeon, you have a slight question there.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up the Piccadilly line we've been talking about. I remember Tim O'Toole coming to us in 2008 saying that has to be the top priority of the next person running the underground in London, and here we still are, so it's extraordinary. I wanted just to pick up a couple of things. In terms of Bakerloo line extension Crossrail 2, clearly they're longer term. Are those routes safeguarded now? Has all that been done on both of them?
Safeguarding is, I'm trying to get this the right way around, done for Crossrail, for Crossrail 2. Bakerloo line extension, we're just finalising that now. It's not quite complete, is my recollection.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick. I think that's the right way around.
Okay.
I have to say credit to Michelle Dix, who was awesome at just getting that Crossrail route safeguarded. But Bakerloo is well in hand.
Really important if we want to resurrect those projects when there is funding, because of developers always trying to take the land. And then in terms of other capital, will you be able to, you probably need to write to me about this, in terms of the river, the piers investment, looking at, you have plans to invest in a number of piers. It'd be useful to know where they are in your capital programme, and also whether you're looking at third-party funding or part funding for some of that going forward.
Yeah, I think we can write to you. That might be part of the business plan where we can talk you through that investment in a bit more detail. But we do have a good track record of securing developer funding for new piers. We've seen a couple of new piers open in the past year or two that have been funded through developer investment.
Right.
And we'll continue to do
But
so.
some of the existing ones in central London and Greenwich, I know, are nearing the end of their life. Therefore, you will need to be planning. And you did have a capital investment plan for the river. It'd be useful to see where you are with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So moving on now to Assembly Member Rogers and road user charging.
Thank you. Actually, I'm just very briefly on that last section. I don't know, mindful of time, but I think it's important to get some clarity around Piccadilly line resignaling, because anyone listening to this discussion now would probably come away with the impression that the delays to that project are solely as a result of the negotiations over the long-term funding settlement. But that project, correct me if I'm wrong, has been was, I think, discontinued was the word used in 2019. So this is a long ongoing issue with that particular project, and obviously of big interest to me. 2 words: Turnham Green. Just if you could add some context around that, please, someone.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Assemblymember Pigeon made reference to Tim O'Toole, previously MD of the Tube. This has been on the to-do list for a long time. You know, as we've progressively been upgrading the signalling across the whole network, the Victoria Line's done, the Jubilee's done, the Northern's done, 4LM, which is the subsurface, is progressively happening. So the Piccadilly and a couple of other lines really stand out. But no, that's not unique to this funding deal. That's a good point of clarification.
But although the theme has been the same, that the barrier to progressing that project has been long-term funding certainty, which was a pre-existing challenge prior to the pandemic. Even in 2019, we did not have a long-term capital deal. We had 2 one-year rollovers of capital funding, and then we went into the pandemic and had the uncertainty related to that. We cannot make long-term strategic investments with short-term capital funding.
Take the point, but it's not tied to this particular deal and this particular set of negotiations was the point I was trying to make. Moving on to my actual question, I think actually this is probably half for Andy, half for Patrick around road user charging. How advanced is TfL's work on smart user charging? So specifically, what current activities are underway? What kind of staff have been recruited? What kind of skill sets have been recruited? And then secondly, what's being considered in terms of revenue being generated from this? So maybe, Andy, if you could take
Okay,
that.
so I'll start. Our primary focus at the moment is, at the Mayor's direction, looking at a Greater London ultra emission zone, the so-called GLULES, and that is that's taking up most of our time. But we do have a number of people looking at the longer-term solution. Would it make sense to have some sort of road user charging scheme which could effectively replace the other schemes that we've got and provide a long-term solution in terms of a better way of charging for road use, but also mindful of the other ancillary benefits, namely the reduction in traffic and the environmental benefits that will derive. In terms of numbers, it's not that many people, but they're highly capable. These are world-class experts in their field, so we're very blessed to have such people. I think
what kind of fields? Sorry.
In terms of understanding how congestion pricing works, how the emission zone would work, in terms of how a smart road user scheme would work. These are experts in their field. They're not people we've brought in. They're people who we already had. That's why I say we're blessed to have already got them. Were we to go down the road of, forgive the pun, of RUC, we would almost certainly need more people, but we, for now, we've got what we need, and the work is progressing, but it's not at a massively advanced stage yet.
So being managed internally, as
yes.
you're not employing consultants or anything like
yes,
that?
it's an internal matter. Now, as you, if it becomes likely to be a reality, you almost certainly would need some more brain power and resource, because it's a hugely complex issue, and we would need then to look at additional resource. For now, we've got what we need.
Thank you. And Patrick, in terms of revenue generation from road user charging?
Well, just on that previous conversation, it's given me an opportunity to clarify a conversation I had with Assembly Member Fortune in the summer when I was talking about recruiting software engineers. That is to build the software to maintain the existing schemes, the congestion charge, the ULEZ, the LES. We're recruiting software engineers such that when that contract comes up, we have the option of having more of it in-house under our direct control, rather than relying solely on software engineers. Rather than relying solely on third-party providers. As Andy said, the future and any future work is very limited and is restricted to those policy implications at this point. In terms of funding, so we have no assumption in any of our current budgets or plans for any form of revenue from smart road user charging or a future road user charging scheme. We do, since about 12 months ago, as a result of the government condition, assume that the Mayor raises around about £500 million per annum of new revenue sources. That includes the measures the Deputy Mayor outlined earlier in the meeting to do with fares and fares changes. And we have assumed the balance could come from a scheme such as the Greater London ULEZ, but no specific assumptions have been made on that, and we'll wait until the Mayor makes a decision and then respond accordingly in our business plan.
So you say that the balance could come from, but you don't have a figure for what that balance would be?
It was in the order of £300 million per annum, but we obviously need to finalise the fares decision, understand what the decision is on Greater London ULEZ, and then we can confirm the actual mix of that new revenue in the business plan.
Okay, and that £300 per annum, how have you forecast how long that would be for? Because presumably this is going to be an income that diminishes every single year.
No, we haven't. So it's a response to the government condition for a single year to raise that amount, rather than it being a recurring, ongoing revenue stream. We absolutely understand that the purpose of schemes such as the ULEZ is to drive behaviour change, and therefore, by definition, will be a transitory income stream once it achieves that objective. And
the cost for the capital cost for expanding ULEZ, it's changed quite understandably. The figure that we've been given has changed a number of times. I think in the settlement letter it says 250 million. Is that the latest estimate? No, that was an estimate we discussed with the government when the funding discussion started, which was about February, which gives you an idea of how long that took. So I think there was a more up-to-date figure included in the consultation material. I don't have that to hand, I'm sorry. Could you write to us with that information, please? Thank you. And perhaps follow-up for Andy. If this road ULEZ expansion is by no means a done deal, the consultation is still being assessed. But based on the current thinking for plans for road user charging, and there's different models you could use apps on phones, trackers in cars, whatever. It seems that a camera network is the way that thinking is going. If ULEZ expansion didn't happen, what would the impact be on the ability of TfL to bring in a wider road user charging scheme?
I have to take advice on that, but I think I understand the gist of your question, namely that if you're relying on the same paraphernalia and the paraphernalia for the former didn't happen, by sort of logically, then you'd have to provide it for the latter. But it's a bit of a hypothetical answer because it's not something I've really thought through. What we do know is that for GLULES there would need to be capital investment in the, to the quantum that we've just been discussing, but which we'll confirm in writing. And the exact nature of the RUC technology has yet to be decided because we're in very, very early days of even thinking, is it a goer in the first place?
Okay, so you don't, TfL doesn't yet have a view on what kind of, what would the look would be for the any kind of wider road user charging scheme?
No, very, very, very early days.
Okay, excellent. Yes, Seb.
Just to augment that, so the purpose obviously of it would be, as Patrick said, to drive behaviour change, to change the transport mix, to get a fairer proportion of the relationship between subsidisers of the system, the transport system, and reducing congestion, reducing pollution, and of course fighting climate change. So that would be the genesis of any policy.
Mm-hmm. And actually, maybe Seb, you can. I may have been forgetting this, but has the Mayor ever put a timescale on road user charging by when he would want to present options or a scheme to London? Before the end of the term?
The Mayor is aware that there will probably need to be some change to the current. You know, we have obviously a range of different measures in place, from the congestion charge through to ULEZ, that are relatively unsophisticated in comparison to a full road user charging scheme. And he said by the end of the decade there would need to be a proposal on what a reform of that system might look like, but no more specific time frame than that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
It is your question again next, but I just wanted to clarify before we move on from road user charging. The committee is planning to investigate this later in the year in more depth, and so we may be writing to you with some written questions for further information on some of these issues that we've brought up today. But also just to say, you mentioned that you're developing all your expertise and all your thoughts on this in-house. In fact, you said it was an internal matter. What I am aware of is that there are many other cities looking at this. Some of the big consultancies are already starting to look at these issues and working things out for those. We know that there are groups such as Campaign for Better Transport, who I used to work for, to declare an interest, but they published a report last week, again, looking at it in more detail. Centre for London may be doing the same thing. So people are coming to you with their proposals. You're ingesting those within your team as well, and are you having discussions with some of those groups, because they have been thinking it through?
They do indeed, and you're right to point that out. And by saying that we have internal capability wasn't meant to say that we're arrogant enough to think that we've got all the answers. It was merely to answer Assembly Member Rogers' point about have we assembled a massive team? No, we haven't. But the very, very smart people we have are aware of developments elsewhere and are talking to them, and it's a two-way conversation. We need to come up with proposals that have been properly thought through if we are to go down this avenue.
Excellent. So just to clarify, you're not spending any money outside of the organisation, but you are talking with people outside of the organisation.
Correct.
Who want to talk to your expert team.
Yes,
and
I'm not aware of any, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. CFO, I'm not aware of any expenditure. There might be minor expenditure, but nothing major. We don't have a huge deployment of consultants, put it that way.
And in terms of the engagement that your experts are carrying out with people outside of the organisation, this would include Assembly members, would it? Because I know that as a committee we're planning an investigation, but there are individuals within our committee who have an interest in this, who might want to have an early discussion with your team on this. Would that be possible for us individually to ask for?
My view, bearing in mind this will post-date me, is that we want to get this right as TfL, so therefore we should seek input from a broad church in terms of understanding what the good ideas are and what the potential pitfalls are, and I think it always smooths the way if you and your colleagues are on side with that, so I wouldn't have an objection to that, and I'm sure my successor wouldn't either.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just personally, my own experience of trying to engage early on things has not always worked out, so it's good to get that commitment in public. Assembly Member Bailey, you have a quick follow-up on that?
I do have a quick question. I'm not massively opposed to road user charge, and I do think it needs to be looked at. But the one conversation that I'd be very interested in what the Deputy Mayor has to say about this is, I already, as a Londoner who occasionally drives, I already pay to use the roads. I pay duty already. So we're in the conversation. No point has anybody mentioned that if we have a road user charge here that the Mayor instigates, Londoners will be paying twice.
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question, and it's obviously, a concern that jumps into people's minds when they hear the word charging. Obviously, in the context of everything that we're facing at the moment, additional costs for simply getting around is not going to be an attractive proposition in and of itself. What we really need to be thinking about is the choices that we make as individuals and collectively. Now, at the moment, in some parts of London, it's relatively easy to make those choices because you have good provision of alternatives to private car use. But nonetheless, the attractiveness of using a car might still be quite high compared to using public transport, because actually the cost can be relatively less sometimes. And you have a situation where, in effect, public transport users are putting money into the road network, and therefore you could argue that they're subsidising private car use. Now, in some parts of London, of course, those options don't exist. So the purpose of this scheme must be to provide the alternatives in those places. And you're quite right, some of us will always need to use a car. There are groups in society for whom the car is an essential part of their transport mix, and I would suspect that most of us would need to use the car some of the time. So what we're talking about here is unnecessary car journeys being removed from the road to enable capacity for those necessary car journeys, and in some cases it could even be more cost effective and cheaper. For example, if you have a scheme that looks at offsetting vehicle excise duty, for example. These are just proposals, but that kind of thinking, I think, is really important. So you're right, we have to address the fact that if people think that or perceive this as just an additional charge, then obviously you're not going to win the favour of Londoners for it. But if they see it as a sophisticated way of redressing the transport mix and increasing the use of public and active transport, then it could be very successful indeed.
But it is an additional charge. If London goes on its own and has its own road user charge, it will be an additional charge because you've had no conversation with the government to do with vehicle excise duty.
Well, I mean, those are the kind of conversations that would take place in the context of a proposal that comes forward. Of course, you would have to talk to central government about any proposal, but particularly this. It would be, a really good, I think, win for the Treasury, for example, if they were to engage proactively on a proposal like that. But that's just one of many, many different ideas that could form the basis of a road user charging scheme.
Chair, this is clearly a very long conversation.
I need to get this back because we are having, as mentioned, a whole investigation into
I am eager to be involved in that because I think a lot of this is...
as a member of the committee, you'll be asked to contribute.
Oh, I will.
Fully.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we are running a tiny bit behind now, members, so let's just speed up the pace a tiny bit. So moving now back to Assemblymember Rogers for further questions about infrastructure.
Thank you, Chair. I mentioned Turnham Green earlier. The other two words that animate me a lot are Hammersmith Bridge, as you can imagine. So, obviously, Hammersmith Bridge is dealt with specifically in the settlement letter. Perhaps, maybe Andy or Patrick, could you explain the level of funding that's being provided by government for Hammersmith Bridge? Is that sufficient? And also, what stage in the process are we with the project?
Well, I can talk to how the funding works. So in the year to date already, we've received £3 million of funding from the DfT specifically for Hammersmith Bridge. And I believe that was calculated on the basis of a third of that particular phase of costs for the bridge. That principle is maintained in this funding letter that during this period, TfL will be expected to contribute a third of the funding required to Hammersmith Bridge, albeit that's subject to the business case and proof that offers taxpayers value for money. So until that design is more developed and there's a firmer estimate of the cost, there's not a specific number attached to Hammersmith Bridge, but it's that principle that the right share, the fair share during this funding period would be a third, with TfL paying a third. But until that design is more progressed, we were not able to provide a number.
Okay. Seb, I wonder if there's a political angle here. What input are you having with the borough on this? Because this has obviously been dragging on for such a long time. This business case seems to have been under preparation for months and months and months. Are you having discussions with the leader in Hammersmith and Fulham about how this is going to be progressed?
Yes, we are, and also with central government as well. So the proposal that we're waiting for, I believe, is due in November. So you're right; it has been a very long time. I'm not aware of the task force having met recently either. So there's a series of sort of delays on this, which can be very irritating, I know. But the proposal from the borough should be with us next month, and from that point on, then it will be much easier to quantify the amount that we need. And obviously, we need to have the discussions with central government and others on what we do with that. But I can assure you, those conversations are happening.
Excellent. That's good to hear. Thank you, Chair.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Moving across to Assembly Member Desai now.
Thank you, Chair. So my question, again starting off with you, Deputy Mayor, is about driverless trains. So what prospects are there for driverless trains in London, given the scale of investment needed to make them a reality? We had Professor Stephen Glester some time ago before this committee. I think he was part of the TfL independent review into driverless trains, and he particularly commented on the expense involved in, I think he was quite scathing actually about the prospects of having driverless trains.
Yes, thank you. It is a condition, obviously, of the funding deal that we investigate the possibility, which is what we're doing. But you're quite right in highlighting the enormous scale and cost that would result in. There are a number of unique circumstances which I know that Andy can go into quite a lot of detail on the difference between, for example, what they've done in Paris and what would be possible in London. I should point out that I think it's line 1 on the Paris Metro, it took well over a decade. They don't have the same problems that we would have with deep tube tunnels and the need for the addition of walkways and emergency access, which effectively would mean an entire tunnel widening project for a deep level tube line, and numerous other things which Andy, I'm sure, will be able to list far more eloquently than I. But you're right; it's that huge cost, which it's hard to get past, to be honest. But as per the requirement, we are, of course, looking at it.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, I could talk for quite a long time on this, but in the interest of time, I'll keep it really brief. I came here on a driverless train. I came here on the DLR, but albeit it is attended, as you know, there is a train attendant. But that is so different to, say, let's take, for an example, the Bakerloo or the Piccadilly line, because there are a number of prerequisites that would need to be in place before you could even countenance getting sign-off from effectively the safety regulator, particularly because, as Seb says, in the deep-level tube, there are no catwalks. There are in the Elizabeth line. You've got a detrainment platform running alongside. And people sometimes say, well, why is the Elizabeth line not driverless? It technically could be, of course, but it goes out onto the main line, or it will very, very shortly. 6th of November, we'll start to have it emerge from the tunnel, go out west and go out east. And for those lines, typically, if you're interacting with other train services, that's a factor. You've got to get the signalling right. You should, in my opinion, you should have platform screen doors. The signalling itself has to be capable of a driverless operation. So for the cost and the time involved, a far better use of funds, back to our earlier conversation, is to finish the job off and get the remaining lines properly re-signalled onto modern moving block signalling before you even begin to go down the road of driverless trains. To me, that would be a folly, but that is a stipulation of the funding deal, so we'll happily have a further look into it. I don't see any prospect of that happening in the short to medium term. We will fulfil our obligation of the funding deal, but to spend too much time on it or too much money on it would, in my professional opinion, be wasted.
Thank you for that answer. As I say, apart from the expense, it's also the safety side implications, which is what the rail unions are sort of very concerned about.
I think you would
rightly, in my
really
opinion.
struggle to get a safety case for the deep level tube, for which there are only two options of detraining. If a train breaks down with no member of staff on, you either go out the front or out the back. There is no provision to evacuate onto the detrainment ramps because there aren't any. Secondly, as Seb said, we actually sent a team over to Paris to have a look at what they do, and they said that they could not have made the case for a retrofit in the same way that is being pitched to us.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, if that's all on that subject, let's move on to the Elizabeth line. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Mr Byford, I know you've made fantastic progress on the Elizabeth line since you've been here, and that's much appreciated out in the east. And we're very much looking forward to early November when we can actually go through. But there's talk of there being a shortfall in the funding. Is that your understanding? And if so, are there any risks related to that?
Okay, so it's important that we understand what we mean by a shortfall in funding. There were three promises that I made before you, and I stand by those promises. They were to get the first phase open by the summer of 2022, which we did in time for the Queen's Jubilee. The second was to get the next phase up and running, and then the third phase with no further delay, and that's all on target. Bond Street will open on the 24th of October. The through running from the east through to Paddington, the west through to Abbey Wood will happen on November the 6th. And then the last phase, which is a true end-to-end, east to west, that's still on schedule for May of 23. And then the third promise I made you was we would not seek recourse to public funds over and above that which we inherited, which was a 1.1 additional billion pound addition as identified by the outgoing Crossrail Board. To date, we've secured 825 million additional. There's a budget pressure of around about 170 million on that, but that's coming down. So that's still well short of the 1.1 additional. So we do know that we'll need something over and above the 825. I've set the team an internal challenge of, I want it to start with an 8, no more than 899. But we have in the most recent funding deals secured an amount of additional funding, which is to be matched by TfL, by the GLA, which I'll just ask Patrick to comment upon. But to reassure you, we will not blow that 1.1 billion, which I said we would not do. We will meet that promise.
So in round numbers, the funding settlement provides 50 million further from government and matches actually the proposition the Mayor made in the GLA budget back in March to provide roundly 50 million from the GLA. So that takes the 825 that Andy referred to 925. So making good progress.
And just to add to that, Keith, if I may, till the day I go, I have, if not daily, but weekly meetings on meeting these challenges, right? And the good news on the funding pressure is at the moment where we have got that pressure over the 825, we are progressively bringing that pressure down so that that aspiration of 899 is still possible, albeit it will be tight.
Just one quick clarification, if I may, Commissioner. So let's look at Romford, the east line, northeast. When can we expect to go through the tunnel?
The 6th.
So
from November the 6th.
Through to Paddington.
Through to Paddington.
Yeah, that's it. That's
so you can come from the east through to Paddington without having to change, and from the west, from Heathrow and Reading through the tunnel to Abbey Wood without having to change. But if you want to do a through journey, we're recommending changing at Whitechapel. Then the full end-to-end, which is not, being able to literally go from Romford through to Heathrow, that will be no later than May of 23.
Great, I can go to GB News on one train. Wonderful.
There you go.
Thank you very much for that. Can I ask a very quick question about passenger numbers on the Elizabeth line? Anecdotally, they seem to be going up quite fast now, and you can fit a lot of people onto those trains, but they are now fullish when I use them, which is sort of in different times of the day. So are you ahead of projections now in terms of passenger revenue on the Elizabeth line? And is that overall a net gain in revenue, or is that transfers from other lines, etc.?
Too early to say in terms of transfer from other lines, which you might be surprised to hear, given that we've been open since May the 24th. But because we've really hardly had a week of normality, there've been, there's been the Queen's funeral, there've been strikes, there's been various other things that have not really enabled us to do that correlation to see how much is new revenue and how much is transferred from, say, the central line. But it won't be long before we have that analysis done. We are delighted with the ridership that we've got. People are flocking to the Elizabeth line, and we've designed it for the future. As you know, there's the potential to add 2 more carriages on the back to increase capacity, and I hope at some point that we are faced with that very pleasant dilemma, in which case we'll have to get the funding for that. But the ridership is ahead of projection right now. We're very pleased with the way people have flocked to the line.
Excellent, that's really good news. And are you also just getting data from the train operating companies? Presumably it's taking some passengers from them too.
Well, that's part of that disaggregation analysis that we're doing. We're looking at what the impact has been in terms of transfer from our own services, but also, and particularly relevant, from November the 6th. It will be interesting to see how many people migrate from Greater Anglia out east and from Great Western out west, and the Heathrow Express for that matter.
Great, thank you. I think I have some outstanding personal commitments coming from you on the questions about westward fares as well, but that is nothing to do with the committee.
One of my colleagues is sitting behind me. I'll make sure that we get that before I go.
Thank you very much. So, moving on to our final question, which I think, Assemblymember Prince, you're taking as well.
Yeah, I'll do it very quickly for you,
yeah, thank you.
Yes. So, risks in the funding settlement, what we're looking at. Which areas of the funding settlement have you considered at most at risk or not being met? And what would be the implications for passengers in that event?
Well, in terms of the funding conditions, we're very proud that we believe that we've met every single funding condition we've got and every single funding settlement we've had during the pandemic. At the last count, it was just over 60. We've had no deductions in any funding, in any previous funding settlements as a result of that. The government did dispute one of our pensions obligations, but we worked that through with them and resolved that dispute. So we would not have signed up a deal that we did not believe that we could deliver, and we will continue our track record of delivering on previous deals and deliver on this one. In terms of the risk, though, there is a risk there, because there are 2 dispute mechanisms set out in the funding deal. There's one general dispute mechanism that's similar to previous funding settlements, that if the government believe we haven't met a funding condition, there's a process to go through, initially the oversight group, then with the Commissioner and the Permanent Secretary, to try and resolve that dispute. If that dispute cannot be resolved, the government have the right to reduce our funding. And in this funding settlement, that right is not capped at a specific level. In the previous funding agreements, that was capped at 50 million, and the first one was capped at 25 million. However, there is an obligation for the government to act reasonably and proportionately in any deduction they make. There's also a specific dispute mechanism, in a complicated manner, related to pensions, which shortcuts that process. And if the Secretary of State believes we have not met the pensions conditions and are not doing everything we can to meet the pension conditions, they can immediately vary the funding that they provide.
So would you say the pensions one was the higher risk?
Potentially, but we had confirmation from DfT officials last week that they're comfortable we met that first deliverable on the 27th of September, and we have every intention of meeting the next 2.
That's good for me. Thank you, Chair. Did you want to?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so we'll need to pay quite close attention to I think it's the disputes and that sort of part. There are some quite complicated processes to go through if something like that arises. Okay, well, that's the end of our main questions. But before we let you go, we just wanted to say, I think as a committee, a very big thank you to you, Andy. I mean, It is traditional for committees to say thank you to departing senior members of staff in this way, but I think in this case you'll find it's particularly warm and particularly anonymous from all of us. When you joined us, that you've all voted anonymously, have you, to say that? Great. Excellent, thank you much. But did I say anonymous? Yes. Unanimous, thank you. So yeah, when you joined us, I don't think we had any idea how deep and long the impact of the pandemic was going to be, and you've actually seen us through that tremendously well, I think. You've also dealt with the problem that I think you came here to solve, which was getting Crossrail completed on time, and getting that sorted out properly and within budget, and that has happened, and we're all extremely pleased with it, particularly some members of the committee. So thank you very, very much, and goodbye from all of us.
Well, thank you. Chair, may I just say, if I may just say a thank you to you, because one, you've always treated me with respect and been fair to me, which I really do appreciate. You know, I have worked in some jurisdictions where that's not necessarily been the case. I appreciate your passion for transport. I appreciate the job you do, on behalf of Londoners, the fact that you do hold us to account. But you've always done that, fairly and also pragmatically, recognising that we've also faced a real tough time. So I really do appreciate it. It's an honour to have been your Transport Commissioner, and it's a period of my career, the pinnacle of my career, that I'll never forget. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you again, once again. Really, really appreciate what you've just said about the committee as well. And although, the first question we'll have for the new commissioner was, please, can we stop saying glue layers? We are going to miss you.
Just be nice to him, okay? He's a good guy.
Sorry, Seb Dance, you wanted to say something.
It was the Mayor has many opportunities to register his thanks to you, Andy. The Deputy Mayor doesn't have very many public fora in which to do so. If I just wanted to put my personal thanks to you, Andy. Andy is an exemplary public servant at a time when I think public service generally comes under a lot of shtick. Well, Andy, you're the embodiment of what a public servant should be, and I think that warmth that the committee has shown you, you'll find in many other quarters, but you certainly find it from me. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Seb. So I'd like to thank all our guests again for attending this morning, for the answers you gave to our questions. The committee has a few more items of business to deal with, but in the meantime, feel free to step out of the chamber. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion, and can we also delegate authority to me as chair, in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members, to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Can we also note the work programme and meeting dates?
Noted.
And note my participation as chair in a recruitment panel to appoint a new chief executive of London Travel Watch?
Noted.
Thank you very much. The next meeting is scheduled for the 15th of November at 10 o'clock here in the chamber, and I have no urgent business, so I can now close the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Good meeting.